So let's start off with chapter 1, the public sector in the economy. So public economics deals with the impact of the public sector or government on resource allocation and distribution. So it is the study of the nature, principles, and economic consequences of expenditure, taxation, financing, and the regulatory actions undertaken by the non-profit making government sector of the economy. So what are the instruments of fiscal policy? Well, we have expenditure, taxation, financing, and regulatory actions. There's 4 of them. So in terms of expenditure, taxation, financing, this entails the procurement and spending of private funds by the state. So this is the direct mobilization and allocation of scarce resources. For example, spending of income tax on primary health care, borrowing funds to build an irrigation dam or highway, tax on cigs, etc. And then regulation, however, entails enacting a law to allocate private resources. For example, smoking bans in public places. And we have different perspectives on the role of government. So we have Smith's laissez-faire, so no government intervention, the Keynesian approach, which is very interventionist, Marxist socialism, and the monetarist approach, which has a limited function. So let's take a look at the views of the role of government in the economy. So with the individualistic or mechanistic view, the key characteristic is that there's maximization of individual welfare, and the role of government is correcting market failures. And the policy focuses on efficiency of resource allocation and economic growth. And then with the public interest or collectivist or organic view, the key characteristic is maximization of social welfare or national interest. The role of government is distribution of income, and the policy focus is combating poverty and equity issues. And with the developmental state view, the key characteristic is that there's a combination of individual and social interests, and the role of government is selective intervention, and policy focus is a way in which political and economic control is obtained and exercised. So what is government? Well, we should know that the public sector includes public enterprises and corporations. The central government includes local governments and provincial governments, and the central government includes government departments. So we should know that the public sector encapsulates both the general government and the central government. But what is the relationship between the public and private sector? Well, government is a supplier of public goods. We should consider the effect of the economy due to the size of government in relation to the type of public services rendered. And the ways in which we finance expenditure has important economic consequences. Budget imbalances also impact the overall economy. The government's actions impact the economy, but the economy's performance also impacts the government's actions. So you should remember that positive economics studies the nature and consequences of decisions taken, so it's objective. For example, if the government raises taxes, what will happen to labor supply? But then normative economics involves making value judgments about what ought to be rather than describing what it is. So it's more subjective. For example, if the government wants a more even distribution of income, what type and level of taxation should be introduced? When we want to know the size of the public sector, we can look at it from the total tax or indirect or direct income of the general government as a percentage of GDP, so the size of the burden that government imposes on taxpayers. Or we can look at it from the expenditure side. So the resource use of the government, aka exhaustive government expenditure. So this is the general government consumption, G, and investment spending by general government and public corporations. You could also look at transfer payments, so non-exhaustive government expenditure, so interest on public debt, and then subsidies and current transfers. You could also look at total public sector resource mobilization by general government and public corporations. Now we move on to chapter 2 with the benchmark model of the economy. So the benchmark model is a general equilibrium model used to determine the ideal situation with regard to economic efficiency. So a country's ability to achieve economic growth. So the basic assumptions of the benchmark model is that it's a 2 by 2 by 2 model. So 2 consumers, 2 producers, and 2 products. There are no external influences, so there's fixed tastes. Production processes with perfect factor substitutability. So labor and capital can be swapped perfectly. Consumers maximize utility and producers maximize profit. And then the commodity and factor markets are perfectly competitive. So you should know that economic efficiency consists of allocative and technical or X efficiency. And achieving perfect economic efficiency ensures the ability to achieve optimal economic growth. So what is allocative efficiency? Well, allocative efficiency is the situation where a country's limited resources are allocated according to the wishes of its consumers, thus optimal mix of products or consumables. So allocative efficiency in a general equilibrium context will only exist when the economy doesn't have a public sector and the economy has no production and consumption externalities. So the economy achieves the following three conditions simultaneously. So first is Pareto optimal production solution, then the Pareto optimal consumption solution, and lastly simultaneous consumer and producer equilibrium. So what is the optimal Pareto optimal consumption solution? Well, this is when it's not possible to increase one consumer's utility position any further without negatively affecting those of all other consumers. But then what about the Pareto optimal production solution? So the input side. Well, this is where it shouldn't be possible to increase output of any one commodity without decreasing the output of other commodities. Thus, the marginal rate of technical substitution for product X, MRTS for X, is equal to the marginal product of labor for product X divided by the marginal product of capital for product X, which is thus equal to the wage rate divided by the real interest rate. And then for product Y, it's the same thing. So the marginal rate of technical substitution for product Y is equal to the marginal product of labor for product Y divided by the marginal product of capital for product Y, which is thus equal to the wage rate divided by the real interest rate, W over R. So under perfectly competitive conditions, each sector will face the same factor prices. So the marginal rate of technical substitution for product X is equal to the marginal rate of technical substitution for product Y, which is thus equal to the wage rate divided by the real interest rate. So MRTSX is equal to MRTSY, which is equal to W over R. And in the Edgeworth-Bowley box diagram, the Pareto optimum is obtained at all points where both sectors' respective isoquants are tangent, and it has to be on the contract line. So in the diagram, you have Y's origin on the top right and X's origin on the bottom left. The curve for product X is pushing upwards towards Y's origin, and the curve for product Y is pushing downwards to X's origin. So we took a look at the Pareto optimal production solution on the input side before, but what about the output side? Well, here the market should ensure that producers produce the optimal output combination under perfectly competitive conditions. It should operate on the production possibility curve, the PPC curve, and the slope of the PPC is obviously change in Y over change in X. The change in input costs or factor prices are unchanged, and any movement on the PPC will result in changes in total cost for both products. So the change in total cost for product X is equal to the negative change in total cost for product Y. So in other words, if you increase the total cost for product X, the total cost for product Y will decrease proportionally. But remember, the marginal cost for product X is equal to the change in total cost for product X divided by the change in quantity of product X. And likewise, the marginal cost of product Y is equal to the change in total cost for product Y divided by the change in quantity of product Y. And lastly, therefore, the change in quantity of product Y divided by the change in quantity of product X is equal to the marginal cost of product X divided by the marginal cost of product Y, which is finally equal to the marginal rate of product transformation of product X and Y. So MRPTXY, the marginal rate of product transformation. But remember, in a perfectly competitive market, producers in each sector will ensure that their marginal cost equals to the market price. Therefore, the marginal rate of product transformation for product X and Y will be equal to the marginal cost of product X divided by the marginal cost of product Y, which is equal to the price of product X divided by the price of product Y. So MRPT X and Y is equal to MCX divided by MCY is equal to PX divided by PY. And this is given by the slope of a tangent drawn to a point on a PPC. So in terms of the Pareto optimal consumption solution, for two consumers A and B, each will maximize their utility given their respective budget constraints, where their marginal rate of substitution for the two products consumed are equal to the corresponding commodity price ratio. Therefore, the marginal rate of substitution for product X and Y for consumer A is equal to the marginal rate of substitution for product X and Y for consumer B, which is equal to the price of product X divided by the price of product Y. So MRSXY for consumer A is equal to MRSXY for consumer B, which is equal to PX divided by PY. And again, the Pareto optimal solution is where it's impossible for either of consumers A or B to increase their respective utilities without decreasing the utilities of other consumers. But then what about simultaneous consumer and producer equilibrium? Well, here the marginal rate of product transformation for product X and Y is equal to the marginal cost of product X divided by the marginal cost of product Y, which is equal to the price of product X divided by the price of product Y, which is equal to the marginal rate of substitution of product X and Y for consumer A, which is equal to the marginal rate of substitution for product X and Y for consumer B. And then what do we mean when we talk about technical or X efficiency? Well, it implies that existing resources are utilized in the most efficient manner possible. A point on the PPC should be reached. Now let's talk a bit about market failure. So the reasons for market failures could be lack of information, lags in adjustments, incomplete markets, non-competitive markets, macroeconomic instability, and distribution of income. And this is why there's government intervention. Now we move on to public goods and externalities with chapter 3. So remember, the benchmark model describes economic efficiency in a perfectly competitive market. But in reality, there's market failures. And remember, the functions of government include the allocative function, the distributive function, and the stabilization function. Market failure is the inability of real-world markets to achieve efficient outcomes. Efficiency is achieved in the benchmark model because preferences for goods and services are revealed by the consumer, competition amongst producers ensures minimum cost model, and perfect information ensures general equilibrium. And the benchmark model is focused on private goods. This means there's rivalry in consumption, so the marginal cost of providing an additional unit is positive, and there's excludability. Let's take a look at the pricing model for private goods. Well, at the equilibrium price 0p, marginal utilities of both consumers equals to the marginal cost, and the price of the private good is equal to the marginal cost. So this is a perfectly competitive model. But now let's talk about public goods, so pure public goods or pure social goods. So these are non-rivalrous in consumption, indivisible, for example, defense, lighthouse, road, etc. And they're also non-excludable, so it's impossible to exclude certain individuals from receiving benefits from consumption of these goods. For example, street lights, you can't exclude people from having that benefit. But now let's take a look at the pricing model for public goods. Well, there's no revealed consumer preferences, so there's no true equilibrium possible. And there's a fundamental difference in the way the market demand curve is derived. Let's take a look at the rules for efficient pricing and allocation of public goods. Well, the sum of individual marginal utilities should be equal to the marginal cost, and the sum of individual prices should be equal to the marginal costs. But now let's talk about who should provide public goods. Well, the provision of these goods by a market in the absence of proper pricing is bound to lead to an undersupply and inefficiencies, and this is through non-delivery or the free rider problem. So the government's powers of coercion enables it to enforce payment, and the optimal delivery of public goods by the government requires price discrimination between different consumers, and the impractical solution is that the government charges a tax price. And there's also a production and financing role of the government. There are examples where goods are privately produced but publicly financed. Now let's talk about mixed and merit goods. So mixed goods have characteristics of both private and public goods. They can be non-rivalrous but excludable, for example, toll roads, subscription television, etc. Or they can be rivalrous but non-excludable, for example, public telephones. So in terms of non-rivalrous but excludable goods, these can be excluded from use, even though the marginal cost of production is still equal to zero. Therefore, the market won't be able to apply perfectly competitive pricing rules, so there's a market failure. And then we have rivalrous but non-excludable. This could be like congestion on city roads. There's rivalry, but you can't exclude people from using public goods. Market failure arises from non-excludability of the mixed good. But now let's talk about merit goods. These are goods where perfectly competitive pricing rules could be used, but it's politically insensible to exclude people from the benefits of such goods. And then the government gets involved in the provision and financing of such goods. For example, education and health services. But now let's talk about externalities. So positive externalities is where the action confers a benefit, and negative externalities is where the action inflicts a cost. And when we talk about action, it could be commitio, acting, or omission, not acting. In terms of commitio, it could be technological or direct effect on production. And then in terms of omission, it could be pecuniary, deals with money. For example, change in market prices, and this impacts on supply and demand. So in terms of externalities, you have demand side externalities and supply side externalities. So looking at the demand side, positive externalities is when the marginal external benefit is larger than zero. Therefore, the marginal social benefit is larger than the marginal private benefit. And then for negative externalities, the marginal external benefit is less than zero. Therefore, the marginal private benefit is larger than the marginal social benefit. And then if we look at externalities from the supply side, we have negative externalities when the marginal external cost is bigger than zero. Therefore, the marginal social cost is bigger than the marginal private cost. And then in terms of positive externalities, the marginal external cost is less than zero. Therefore, the marginal private cost is larger than the marginal social cost. So with the demand side, we look at benefits, and with the supply side, we look at costs. So if we take a look at a graph of a negative production externality, we'll have the price on the y-axis and the quantity on the x-axis. We'll have two supply curves going upward. SS, the social supply, which is equal to the marginal social cost, and then SP, the private supply, which is equal to the marginal private cost. And then we'll have a demand curve going downward, intersecting the two supply curves, and this is the marginal social benefit. And as you'll see, as the supply curve shifts upward from the private supply to the social supply, the equilibrium moves from E0 to E1, and the prices increase from P0 to P1, and the quantity decreases from Q0 to Q1. So an example of this is a coal mine polluting the air. So it's negative because the marginal social cost is larger than the marginal private cost. So a typical market situation is where we have an equilibrium at E0 with a price and quantity of P0 and Q0. The externality is where we have a new equilibrium at E1 with a price and quantity of P1 and Q1. So pollution raises the external cost to a point above the marginal private cost. Therefore, the marginal external cost is larger than zero, and the marginal social cost is larger than the marginal private cost. And on the graph, the total private cost is represented by the area KE0Q0, and the total external cost is represented by the area KE0 and F. And this is the distance or area between the marginal social cost and the marginal private cost. Therefore, in a competitive market, this leads to overprovision and underpricing. But now let's take a look at the opposite case, a positive production externality. For example, a bee farmer's bees pollinate the apple blossoms of the orchard on the neighboring farm, or education, vaccine, getting an electric car, etc. So in this case, the position of the private supply curve and the social supply curve would be swapped. So in this case, the marginal private cost would be larger than the marginal social cost. The supply curve would be shifting down, and the prices would decrease from P0 to P1, and the quantity would increase from Q0 to Q1. So we're still on the supply side, and what happens is that the marginal external cost is less than zero, and the marginal social cost is less than the marginal private cost. Therefore, in a competitive market, we'd get underprovision and overpricing. But now let's take a look at a positive consumption externality. So again, on a graph, we'd have the price on the y-axis and the quantity on the x-axis. We'd have a single supply curve going upward, which is the social supply, which is equal to the marginal social cost. And then we'd have two demand curves going downward. dP, the private demand, which is equal to the marginal private benefit, and then ds, the social demand, which is equal to the marginal social benefit. And as you'll see from the graph, the demand curve shifts right upwards towards the social demand. And this results in the price decreasing from P0 to P1 and the quantity increasing from Q0 to Q1. So an example of this is flu injections, and this is on the demand side or consumption. So it's positive because the marginal social benefit is larger than the marginal private benefit. And then a typical market situation is where we have an equilibrium at E0 with the price and quantity of P0 and Q0. We have a positive externality where the new equilibrium is at E1 with a price and quantity of H and Q1. So the social benefit raises the external benefit above the marginal private benefit. Therefore, the marginal external benefit is larger than zero, and therefore the marginal social benefit is larger than the marginal private benefit. And then the total private benefit is represented by the area P1, G, and Q1. And the total external benefit is represented by the area P1, G, E1, and H. Therefore, in a competitive market, we'd have an underprovision and underpricing. Now let's take a look at the opposite case with a negative consumption externality. For example, cigarette smokers and secondhand smoke, or noise pollution, traffic congestion, etc. So again, here we have a negative consumption externality. So the marginal external benefit is less than zero. Therefore, the marginal social benefit is less than the marginal private benefit. Therefore, in a competitive market, we'd have an overprovision and overpricing. And again, on a graph, the positions of the private demand and social demand would be swapped. And the private demand would be shifting down to the social demand. The price would increase and the quantity would also increase. But now let's take a look at the possible solutions to these negative externalities. So first we have Pigovian taxes. So here you impose an ad valorem tax, so a tax that's part of the value of the product. So this would raise external costs for the private individual, so the MPC, marginal private cost, would increase. And it would raise the marginal private cost to a point where the marginal social cost would be equal to the marginal private cost. And this is a way of internalizing the cost. And then we have Pigovian subsidies. Here the government subsidizes the provision of goods. So it increases the private benefits, the marginal private benefit, up to the marginal social benefit. But some of the shortcomings of Pigovian subsidies is information constraints on the size of the externality, the shape and slope of curves, and respective supply and demand schedules. But then what about regulation as a possible solution? So this could be relevant in connection with negative production externalities, and this could be enforced by means of legal sanctions. It's very direct and has command and control. The government determines and enforces a socially efficient production level. But the shortcomings of regulation is the lack of information, and reduction is enforced on multiple firms without taking individual cost structures into consideration. Another possible solution is the creation of regulated markets, like a cap and trade program. For example, setting a cap on carbon emissions in South Africa. And then you can sell the rights to pollute. And these are known as effluent fees or permits. And if you're unwilling to buy the rights to pollute, then you must stop polluting or change to a cleaner technology. But then the shortcomings of this is that it assumes perfect knowledge. We could also look at the support of alternative markets. So the government could support cleaner technology, for example, renewables instead of coal-firing electricity. The shortcomings of this would be political will, bureaucratic lags in permission, and licensing. What about property rights as a solution? The Coase theorem says that if property rights are well defined and enforceable, transaction costs are negligibly small. Mutually beneficial exchange of property rights can be fully internalized. The shortcomings is that it's often very difficult to determine true transaction costs. And lastly, what about global public goods and merit goods as a possible solution? Well, this is where the benefits of public goods extend beyond country borders. Neighboring countries often enter into cooperative agreements for financing or provision of such services. For example, national defense, long-haul rail infrastructure across borders, and sending doctors to other countries, etc. But if spatial benefits could be quantified, beneficiaries could be charged accordingly. But due to imperfect information, free riding hampers efficient pricing, and the only sensible alternative is to charge a tax price. Another problem is that the sovereignty issues here necessitate bilateral or multilateral cooperation agreements. Now we move on to allocative efficiency and imperfect competition and regulation with Chapter 4. So in imperfect competition, you'll have the price on the y-axis and the quantity on the x-axis, and you'll have the marginal cost curve going upwards very sharply, the average total cost ATC going up in a more gradual manner, and then the marginal revenue and demand going downwards. And remember, the demand is equal to the average revenue, which is also equal to the price. The point at which the marginal cost curve and the demand curve intersect is the perfectly competitive price. If there's a monopoly, the price will increase from PC to PM, the monopoly price, and the quantity will decrease from QC to QM, the quantity under monopoly. This price is where they will earn an economic profit, but this will lead to a deadweight loss. So you should know, with statutory artificial monopolies, perfect competition is technically feasible, but there are legal or institutional barriers. And with natural monopolies, the cost structure necessitates only one producer, and there are large capital outlays. But then what is the social cost of monopolies? Well, they lead to a deadweight loss, allocatively inefficient. Monopolists raise the price and lower or restrict production compared to a perfectly competitive situation. Consumers pay a price that exceeds the marginal cost of production, and resources are misallocated in such a situation. So in perfect competition, the marginal rate of product transformation for product X and Y is equal to the marginal cost of product X divided by the marginal cost of product Y, which is equal to the price of product X divided by the price of product Y. But if producer Y is a monopolist, then the price of product Y is larger than the marginal cost of product Y, while the price of product X is equal to the marginal cost of product X. So there's violation of the second and third condition of Pareto optimality. But now let's discuss the efficiency implications of a monopoly. So on a production possibilities graph, you'll have the quantity of product Y on the y-axis and the quantity of product X on the x-axis. And then two curves pushing outward, and then various points on the graph that represent different levels of production for product X or Y. So as you look on the graph, the competitive equilibrium at C is where the marginal rate of product transformation for product X and Y is equal to the marginal cost, which is equal to the price. But then if we have a monopoly, a private monopoly, we have a new production point with M0. The economy produces less of product Y at a higher price, and the marginal rate of product transformation for product X and Y is bigger than the price of product X divided by the price of product Y. The distance between C and M0 represents the allocative inefficiency, and this might also lead to an X inefficiency or technical inefficiency. And producing at a point below the PPC would be at M1. But now let's discuss the arguments regarding the efficiency of monopolies. So what about the arguments against monopolies with Liebenstein? Well, they argue they lack incentives to maintain high labor productivity levels. They also argue monopolies don't take sufficient time and effort necessary to acquire correct information. Monopolies also fail to achieve a Pareto optimal allocation of resources and may end up at point M1, for example, producing below the PPC. What about arguments for monopolies? Schumpeter. Well, they argue monopolistic firms are in a better position to achieve technological advancement than their perfectly competitive counterparts. The production possibilities curve shifts from R0 T0, the first curve, to R1 T1, the outer curve. So it moves beyond the original production possibility curve to M2, for example. Now let's talk about deregulation or removing barriers to entry. Well, this could improve both allocative efficiency and X efficiency. So it could be a move to M3, for example. However, decreased profits among competitive firms may fall short of M2 outcome, depending on whether the profit sacrifice can offset the slower pace of technological development. So natural monopolies are characterized by large capital requirements, increasing economies of scale over the entire output range, and minimum average cost of production is sufficient to satisfy the entire market demand. For example, utilities like water and electricity, etc. Remember, increasing returns to scale implies that the long-term average cost decreases as output increases. So essentially, the long-term marginal cost will run below the long-term average cost across the entire output range. If a natural monopoly isn't controlled by the government, it will maximize profit at point M and thus produce at QM and price at PE. So a natural monopoly in a decreasing cost industry, you'll have the price on the y-axis and the quantity on the x-axis. The demand and marginal revenue curves going down, with the marginal revenue curve being below the demand curve as usual. And remember, the demand curve is the same as the marginal social benefit. The average cost curve will be above the marginal cost curve, and remember, the marginal cost curve is the same as the marginal social cost. And again, the point at which the marginal cost curve intersects the demand curve is the first equilibrium, or the equilibrium under perfectly competitive conditions. However, the point at which the marginal cost curve intersects the marginal revenue curve is where we determine the monopoly price and monopoly quantity produced. So the point at which the marginal cost curve and the marginal revenue curve intersect is point M, and that corresponds to point F on the demand curve, which will show us what the monopoly price is, and that'll be way above the competitive price. Point M will also show us where the monopoly quantity produced is, and it is way less than the quantity produced under perfectly competitive conditions. And the distance between the competitive price and the monopoly price represents the economic profit, or abnormal profit. So competitive equilibrium, E1, will have output at QE and a price at PE. And the consumer surplus is represented by the area A, PE, and E1. But then in a natural monopoly, the long-term average cost decreases over the entire output range, and we have equilibrium at M, and an output at QM and a price at PM. There's too little being produced at a high price due to the existence of a monopoly. And the consumer surplus in a monopoly is APMF, and there's welfare loss to society. And the ownership of firms, state or private sector, is irrelevant to welfare losses. Now let's take a look at an overview of policies aimed at improving efficiency. So there are several options available depending on the type of externalities created in the market. For example, water supply and electricity are important inputs for many other sectors. So from the previous graph, at M, the marginal social benefit, which is the demand, is larger than the marginal social cost, which is the supply. So the only way to stop pecuniary externalities on other sectors is to expand production and lower prices to, for example, QE, PE, or E1. Lowering the price thus causes internalization of social benefit. So options to achieve this is when the government takes ownership of the natural monopoly and applies the marginal cost pricing at E, but then the monopoly incurs a loss of E1 and S, so the average cost will be larger than the average revenue, and this will need to be subsidized by the government through higher taxes, and this will cause an excess burden elsewhere in the economy, largely on taxpayers. The government may also borrow money to subsidize, but it may put pressure on interest rates, and this leads to the crowding out effect of private sector investment in society. But what about competitive restructuring or unbundling at improving efficiency? Well, here we consider all production elements of the natural monopoly and decide which parts are decreasing cost industries. Let's take electricity supply as an example. So there's 4 parts. First is generation, the production of electricity by power plants. Second is transmission, long distance transportation of electricity at high voltage. Then we have distribution, short distance transportation at lower voltage. And the last part is the supply and sale of electricity to end users. So only part 2 and 3 are true natural monopolies. The rest could be privatized, or at least competition is feasible there. But now let's talk about privatization. Well, this is the transferal of production of goods and services from public sector to the private sector. And this occurs in education and medical services. So with total transferal, the government retains no control over any aspect of production. But then with quasi-privatization, there's a sharing of roles, responsibilities, and risks between private and public sectors. For example, PPPs, public-private partnerships. And then we also take a look at the BOOT model, BOOT model, build, own, operate, transfer. So here we have the privatization of construction financing and maintenance for a specified period. Thereafter, its ownership reverts back to the government. But what about some of the considerations we have to make when looking at policies aimed at improving efficiency? Well, first we have costs versus efficiency. In terms of costs, they reduce financial losses to governments. And then in terms of efficiency, even though private monopolies tend to be more efficient or technical efficient, allocative efficiency gains will only realize when the privatized firm experiences competition. But what about equity considerations? Job losses, service delivery, free basic services, etc. It may be inefficient but employs people, so the welfare increases, but then maybe efficiency decreases. The immediate cost associated with privatization makes it highly controversial despite empirical evidence of longer-term efficiency gains. Now let's talk a bit about regulation. Well, economic regulation is when rules are made by governments to control entry and prices, and is performed by regulatory agencies like NERSA, ICASA, etc. So regulation performs a supplementary role during restructuring or privatization to ensure more efficient outcomes in the absence of competition. So the aim of economic regulation is to limit privatized monopolies from pursuing abnormal or economic profits, partly for efficiency gains, but also to protect the interests of the users of goods produced by the privatized monopoly. So in a graph, you'll have the natural monopoly, a decreasing cost industry with and without regulation. So as usual, we have the demand curve going downward, which is also the same as the marginal social benefit. Then we have the marginal revenue curve going down under it. And then we have 2 cost or supply curves, the average cost at the top and the marginal cost or the marginal social cost at the bottom. So where the marginal cost curve intersects the marginal revenue curve will give us the monopoly price and quantity. So the highest price will be at PM and the lowest quantity will be QM in a monopoly. And then where the marginal cost curve intersects the demand curve will give us the equilibrium price and quantity. So in perfectly competitive markets, we have the lowest price at PE and the highest quantity at QE. But then if we introduce regulation into this monopoly market, we'll have a lower price than the PM or the monopoly price, but still higher than the equilibrium price. And at the same time, we'll have a quantity that's higher than the monopoly quantity, but still lower than the equilibrium quantity. Now let's talk a bit about rate of return regulation or profit regulation. Well, the regulated firm's capital and operating cost is the area T, H, Q, R, and 0. So it's the lowest rectangle. Profit is thus added to cost, thus determining price. So the price will vary depending on the rate of return, ROR, allowed by the regulator. But the problems with setting the rate of return is cost padding and capital intensifying production, etc. But then what about price cap regulation? Well, this is regulation by setting a maximum price while considering revenues, acceptable rate of return, etc. This incentivizes firms to cut costs or increase productivity. And the formula for it is P equals to RPI minus X. P being the allowed price by the regulator, RPI being the retail price index, and then X being the rate of productivity growth. But then the drawbacks for regulators is the dense information requirements and close monitoring of firms' compliance in absence of competition. But now let's take a look at sliding scale regulation. Well, this combines elements of the rate of return regulation and price cap regulation. So sliding scale regulation is regulation primarily based on capping prices to maximize inherent advantages for the firm's efficiency, but it allows for the price cap to be reduced at a predetermined higher profit level reached by the firm. It incentivizes additional profits as the proceeds will now be shared by the firm and consumers. But the drawback is that there's equally formidable information requirements for effective regulation. But what about regulation in developing countries? Well, effective regulation will cause an outward shift in the PPC, the production possibilities curve. But the problem here is regulatory capture. Regulatory agencies get cozy with the industries they're supposed to regulate, and it's not in the public interest. Now we move on to equity and social welfare with Chapter 5. Let's take a look at some of the tools for assessing welfare effects of public policy. Well, first we have the Pareto criterion. Here, policy-induced change is only justified if it's improving the welfare of at least one member of society without harming the others. And then we have the Bergson criterion. Here, welfare might be improved through policy-induced change, even where an individual is left worse off. This is provided that overall societal welfare improves. Let's take a look at Nozick's entitlement theory. Here, the role of government is protecting individual freedom. In principle, it's opposed to distributional policies infringing on the freedom of individuals. So it follows the Pareto criterion and is a libertarian approach to public policy. It is the maximization of negative freedom, which is essentially the protection of the individual's right not to be coerced by others. But now let's take a look at the 3 principles of justice here. Well, first we have justice in acquisition. Individuals are only allowed to acquire things not belonging to anyone else, and not allowed to make others worse off than before the acquisition. So it applies more to things, only property and capital goods. And then we take a look at justice in transfer. Individuals are only allowed to transfer material things on a voluntary basis. For example, gifts, grants, bequests, and voluntary exchanges. Then violation of the previous 2 principles gives rise to Nozick's 3rd principle of justice. Rectification of justice in holdings. Redistribution of wealth is potentially justified only if one or both of the first 2 principles of justice were violated. But now let's take a look at the other Pareto criteria, so justifications for redistribution. So policies aimed at redistributing income from rich to poor people can be justified on Pareto grounds on the basis of addressing externalities. In other words, the existence of poverty leads to a range of social ills. The rich may transfer part of their income in order to reduce potentially negative external effects that also impact them. And then we can also look at the insurance motive. Individuals may view their tax payments as a relatively inexpensive way of insuring themselves against future loss. Thus, it's an alternative to taking out private insurance. Both of the above criteria rely on the principle of quid pro quo, sacrificing something in exchange for a material benefit. But what about altruism? Individuals may experience net increases in utility from policies taxing their own income and redistributing it to others in society. So there are implied external effects in consumption. So in terms of consumer A's utility function, UA is equal to F bracket MA, comma UB bracket MB, close bracket. So essentially we're saying the utility of person A is a function of person A's income or asset value and the utility of person B as well as person B's income or asset value, with first derivatives all positive. Thus, consumer A derives utility not only from their own income, MA, but also from the level of utility experienced by consumer B. However, consumer B derives utility only from their own income. So the first equation can be simplified to UA equals to G, open bracket, MA, MB, close bracket. So we can then state that the condition for a Pareto efficient redistribution of income for the altruist A to the non-altruist B is 0 is bigger than the first derivative of person A's income, which is bigger than the first derivative of person B's income, which is bigger than 0. So the first derivative of MA and MB represent the increase in person A's income and the increase in person B's income. So 0 is bigger than the increase of person A's income. However, the increase in person B's income is smaller than the increase in person A's income. However, it's still larger than 0. Thus, the increase in A's utility resulting from B's higher income must exceed the decrease in A's utility resulting from the drop in their income. Therefore, A must experience a net increase in utility given that B is better off. Most real-world examples of altruistic actions leading to increases in net welfare position is voluntary. But then in terms of the Bergson criteria, the community's welfare is defined in terms of utilities of all the individuals that the community is made up of. So it's an additive or cardinal social welfare function. So W, the community's welfare, is equal to UA, the utility of person A, plus UB, the utility of person B, plus UC, the utility of person C, etc., etc. So again, what is Pareto efficient redistribution? Well, this is when both individuals' welfare are increased, or one's welfare is increased without negatively affecting the welfare of others. So here there's a higher threshold for redistribution. But then what is Bergson efficient redistribution? Well, here you can increase overall welfare of society by increasing one person's level of welfare while decreasing another individual's welfare, as long as societal welfare function is maintained at the same level. Here we have a lower threshold for redistribution. So the problems with the additive function is that there are measurability issues, assumption of identical utility functions, and the assumption that utility is derived only from income. So in terms of a Bergson function, you'll have the utility of person B on the y-axis, for example, and the utility of person A on the x-axis. And you'll have a utility possibility frontier, not to be confused with the production possibility frontier. You'll have various welfare curves going upward, and what looks like a production possibility curve going outward. And where they intersect represents how much of person A or B's utility there is. For example, at point H, we decreased person B's utility in order to increase person A's. And then we can also take a look at the Bergson production possibilities curve. So we'll have product Y on the y-axis and product X on the x-axis. And then we also have welfare curves going upward. And where they intersect, the production possibility curve that's going outward represents how much of product X or Y is being produced in the economy. Let's talk a bit about distributional policy. So on the curve, you'll see that competitive equilibrium exists at C, but society prefers S, so the tangency of W2 to the UPF or the PPF, the utility possibility frontier and the production possibilities curve. But then how do we get government to move production from C to S? How do we get it to produce more of X and less of product Y, or decrease person B's utility while increasing more of A's? Well, the government can tax the industry producing Y and subsidize the industry producing X, for example, corporate or excise taxes. Or they can tax one individual and subsidize the other, for example, personal income tax route. Lastly, they can also redirect its own government spending from one sector to another. But let's talk about efficiency considerations. This is because redistributive policies imply reallocation of resources. The government's redistributive policies might impact the willingness to work. It might also limit savings and thus investment levels in the economy. Now we move on to chapter 6 with public choice theory. So we've got three main voting rules. First we have unanimity, where 100% must agree. Then we have the ordinary majority rule, so 50% plus 1. And then the optimal voting rule. There is also the dictatorial rule, but this leads to the abuse of power. Let's talk about the unanimity rule and the Rawlsian experiment. Well, with unanimity, each individual needs to support the proposal. It becomes a collective decision. And this is the only voting rule that will lead to the Pareto optimal solution. And then in terms of the Rawlsian experiment, it focuses on the process by which individuals reach unanimity. So the process is that individuals pass through a veil of ignorance into the original position, at which they're unaware of their place in society. This makes them equally risk-averse. And the social welfare function depends on the lower of two individual utilities. So the welfare function W is equal to the minimum of UA and UB, the utility of person A and the utility of person B. So if the utility of person A is larger than the utility of person B, then the social welfare function is equal to the utility of person B. So the outcome is a maximum strategy where society will give priority to the worse off party. And as we'll soon learn about, the unanimity rule would also be impractical. Not everyone would agree and it'd take a lot of time. Now we move on to majority voting and the median voter, aka the ordinary majority rule, which is the most common choice rule. So in a direct democracy, it'd be 50% plus one vote. In a representative democracy, voters elect representatives that make decisions on their behalf. We should know that politicians behave in a way that maximizes votes in elections. Vote maximizing behavior is an important tool in transforming individual preferences into social preferences. Now let's talk about the median voter theorem. So in determining what would make the population happiest or cause less harm, the optimal decision is that of the median voter. The median voter represented by the person dividing the overall population's preferences in two. And this is given preferences aren't extreme. But what are the problems with the model? Well, politicians don't always behave according to the median voter theory in the real world. They might pursue public interest. And then the model assumes that the median voter can always be identified. And it assumes that all voters are rational and will vote. It also assumes that both voters and politicians are perfectly informed on all possible choices and preferences of society. Let's take a look at some of the majority voting and median voter advantages and disadvantages. While majority approval takes less time and is less costly than achieving unanimous support, it's also much less likely that a minority will prevent a majority from realizing its preferences. The disadvantage is that the majority rule affects a winner-takes-all solution, where minority interests may be ignored or even tyrannized. Now let's talk a bit about the impossibility theorem. This notes that even the majority voting rule can lead to logically inconsistent results in the voting system. It concludes that there's not a single voting rule that would meet all the minimum ethical conditions for an acceptable social choice rule. But what might be these ethical conditions for an acceptable social choice rule? Well, first is rationality. Consumers should prefer either of two products or be indifferent. Their preferences should also adhere to transitivity. The second ethical condition is the independence of irrelevant alternatives. The choice is between X and Y, and thus Z is irrelevant. The third condition is the Pareto principle. If person A prefers X over Y, and person B thinks X and Y are the same or comparable, then X will be preferred over Y overall. The fourth condition is unrestricted domain. Therefore, it's possible for all voters to vote. And then the fifth and last ethical condition is non-dictatorship. So these are all perfectly reasonable conditions. However, it results in problematic outcomes where voters with extreme preferences exist. So where extreme preferences exist and pairwise voting occurs, it may lead to the following. First is the voting paradox. A new winner may emerge every time the voting sequence is changed. Preferences of voters may be consistent, but collective preferences will not be consistent. And then we have cycling. When the above process continues indefinitely, so when the voting paradox happens again and again and again. And then we have agenda manipulation. If the organizers of elections are aware of the existence of extreme preferences, they can organize the sequence of voting in a way that may result in a specifically desired outcome. And this would not be a true reflection of voters' preferences and thus not lead to an optimal allocation of resources. So an extreme preference, for example, could be a small over a large over a medium budget. Now let's talk a bit about majority voting and preference intensities. The shortcoming of the majority rule is that it doesn't allow for different intensities of preference amongst voters. A possible solution is preferences being weighted. Now let's take a look at log rolling. So log rolling or vote trading can also be a way to reflect true preferences in voting. For example, a minority can trade its support for an issue enjoying strong support amongst the majority in exchange for majority support for a minority issue. Log rolling could also occur where different minorities team up against the majority. Now we move on to optimal voting rules. So here the voting majority varies depending on the particular public issue voted on. Optimal majorities depend on costs to voters associated with voting. Costs are categorized as external costs or decision-making costs. But what are external costs? This is when a decision is taken that goes against the interest of an individual or group of voters. The higher the degree of unhappiness amongst voters, the higher the external cost will be. So in dictatorial rule, the external cost will be closer to 100%. But with the unanimity rule, it'll be closer to 0%, since everyone agrees. So then what are decision-making costs? Well, these are the costs involved in persuading voters to support a particular public issue. The smaller the community of voters, the lower the decision costs will be. The closer the voting rules move to unanimity, the higher the cost will be. So on a graph, you'll have the cost on the y-axis and the number of voters on the x-axis. you'll have a cost going up, which is the decision-making costs, and then a cost going down, which is the external costs, and then the total cost curve that is above them. The lowest point on the total cost curve coincides with M star, which determines the optimal voting rule. So the characteristics of the optimal majority is that the higher the external costs, the greater the optimal majority. So there's a positive relationship between the external costs and the optimal majority. And then the higher the decision-making costs, the lower the optimal majority. So there's a negative or inverse relationship between the decision-making costs and the optimal majority. You should know that the optimal majority, M star, doesn't need to be an ordinary majority, 50% plus 1. It could be 30% or whatever. It will differ depending on the shape and position of the external and decision-making costs. You should also know that homogeneity or uniformity among voter communities influences both external and decision-making costs. Now let's talk about government failure, politicians and bureaucrats. So government failure is obviously when the objectives of government intervention aren't fulfilled. So but what are the sources of government failure? Well, this could be the rational behavior of politicians pursuing vote maximizing strategies. This could also be the rational behavior by state bureaucrats resulting in bureaucratic failure. It could also be rational behavior by citizens and interest groups in the form of rent-seeking. So in terms of politicians, these are entrepreneurs engaging in vote maximization strategies to secure and retain political office. And then in terms of bureaucrats and civil servants, they will try and maximize their budgets. And this results in an over-provision of goods. So in terms of bureaucratic failure, you'll have the benefits and costs on the y-axis and the quantity of the public good on the x-axis. You'll have the marginal social cost going upward like a supply curve, and the marginal social benefit going downward like a demand curve. And the quantity is increasing from Q0 to Q1, moving up along the marginal social cost curve and down along the marginal social benefit curve. But when you look at it from an aggregated perspective, so total social cost and total social benefit, the total social benefit increases at a decreasing rate, and the total social cost increases at an increasing rate. As the quantity of the public good increases from Q0 to Q1, Q1 is the point at which the total social cost curve intersects the total social benefit curve. Now let's talk a bit about rent-seeking and corruption. So what is economic rent? Well, this is payment to resource owners over and above the payment that the resource would have received in alternative employment, similar to monopoly profit. Artificially created rent usually results from government-protected monopoly power. For example, trading licenses for hawkers, regulation of the taxi industry, real estate sales, etc. Now, in terms of rent seeking, you'll have a graph with price on the y-axis and quantity on the x-axis, a downward sloping demand curve, and two flat supply curves. So initially, what you'll see is that output levels are at Q0 at a price of P0. The state intervenes to limit output to Q1, resulting in prices rising to P1 and causing a loss of consumer surplus equal to the area P0, E0, E1, and P1. So the conventional theory is that the area P0, A, E1, and P1 represents the costless transfer from consumers to producers after the output restriction, and the triangle A, E1, E0 is the deadweight loss. And this all happens after the government restricts output by raising the supply curve from S0 to S1, keeping in mind that the supply is equal to the marginal cost and the average cost. And this pushing up of the supply curve decreases the quantity from Q0 to Q1. So but what is rent seeking? Well, it shows that the conventional theory may not be true if producers have undertaken a lobbying function for rent seeking. So this is when the additional costs were internal to them, effectively raising their marginal cost to MC1. Therefore, all the rent consequent upon government intervention will have dissipated and the entire area P0, E0, E1, P1 will constitute the welfare loss to society. So if there's rent seeking and producers are lobbying, the deadweight loss to society will be larger. If lobbying was undertaken by a group other than producers, the conventional theory would hold. Now we move on to public expenditure and growth with Chapter 7. So the Constitution directly or indirectly impacts the extent and composition of government expenditure, including the provision of basic goods and services. And when we talk about constitutional entitlements, it means the right to certain goods and services are conferred by the Constitution. But it can be a little bit unclear when it comes to budgetary constraints in provision of these goods and services. They use words like reasonable measures and within its available resources. Too much discretion could threaten macroeconomic sustainability of fiscal policy. And we should know that future growth depends on the current provision of services, so education, healthcare, and the MTEF, the Medium Term Expenditure Framework. In terms of the size and growth of public expenditure right now, the share of resource use increases at a diminishing rate, and there's even larger decreases in the long-term real economic growth. So there's been functional shifts in public spending. There's been a growth in labor-intensive public order, safety, and education, so the growth in the government wage and other goods and services. There's also been growth in transfers to households, so social security and welfare services, and a decrease in the share of subsidies for economic services. But now we should take a look at the reasons for government growth, so these macro models, theories to explain expanding governments. But remember, the government expenditure growth is not the same as the growing share of government in the economy. So, but what is the fiscal contract? Well, the fiscal contract is an agreement, formal or informal, between a government and its citizens outlining the rights, duties, and obligations regarding fiscal matters. For example, taxation, government spending, and public services. So the idea is that citizens pay tax for governance, and this is the fiscal social contract. And this tax is an input to fiscal policy. And then the output to fiscal policy is expenditure, in the form of growth and development. For growth, there's a lot of capital expenditure. So it's pro-growth and there's a tax base. And then for development, there's current expenditure, and it's pro-poor and for the social wage. And remember, you can calculate the size of government by getting the government expenditure divided by the GDP. But remember, the quality of government is more important than the size of government. But then the failures of bigger governments has a larger impact than the failures of smaller governments. So taxation can be a channel to demand accountability and responsiveness. Where a state needs taxpayers, like in South Africa, reciprocity and tax bargaining may constitute an accountability mechanism. But now, what is Wagner's law? Wagner's law states that public expenditure will increase if GDP per capita increases or income increases. So public expenditure and income have a positive relationship. And the implication is that government expenditure will increase faster than the output of the economy. And so government expenditure is a function of prices and income, P and Y. But let's take a look at three important factors during industrialization that impacts government functions. Well, first is the expansion in administrative and protective functions, so legal relationships. Second is the cultural and welfare expenditure, so education and redistribution of income. So income elasticity is larger than one, so it's very elastic. And third is the development of monopolies, so capital investment and market failures. But what are the three requirements for Wagner's law? Well, it's rising GDP per capita or income, technological and institutional changes, and the assumption of democratization. But the criticism of Wagner's law is that it's an organic view of the state and not mechanistic or individualistic. And there's no allowance for efficiency implications of the increasing share of the government or in individual preferences, public choice. Now let's take a look at Peacock and Wiseman's displacement effect. Well, it describes the phenomenon where government spending tends to increase during times of crisis or emergencies. But once the crisis is over, the spending level doesn't return to its original level. Instead, it remains at the elevated level, leading to a permanent increase in the size of the government. Now let's take a look at the Meltzer-Richard hypothesis on why the size of government is increasing. Well, it says that majority voting, the median voter, determines the magnitude of income distribution and the share of government expenditure. So redistributional policies leads to higher taxes and government expenditure, especially on social services. And the rational median voter maximizes their utility, and this impacts the economic behavior of other individuals. Now let's take a look at the micro models of expenditure growth. So what is Baumol's unbalanced productivity growth? Well, this is a phenomenon where productivity growth is higher in some sectors of the economy than others, leading to rising costs in sectors with low productivity growth. So government spending may increase disproportionately because of the increase in prices of inputs used by the public sector relative to those in the private sector. So the progressive sector is sectors of the economy where productivity growth is high. For example, technology, manufacturing, service industries, etc. So there's increases in the productivity of employees and thus an increase in wages and salaries. But what about non-progressive sectors? Well, these are sectors with low productivity growth, often due to them being inherently labor-intensive. for example, healthcare, education, etc. So these have sporadic increases in productivity. But now let's take a look at Brown and Jackson's macroeconomic model. Well, it identifies and combines important and relevant factors that influence the demand and supply of public goods and services. So it recognizes that government expenditure can change without a change in the level of service. And that may be a possible inefficiency. So factors to consider here is the changes in service environment. For example, increased crime in South Africa would mean that government expenditure should increase. Otherwise, there's poor service. Then we also have population growth. So this means a higher provision of public goods and services. This also means there's more people to carry the tax burden. Therefore, there's decreases in the unit costs. Another factor is the quality of goods. So more inputs in production. So increases in quality may put more pressure on government expenditure if the costs aren't recovered from users. So pressure from politicians, bureaucrats, and interest groups like aid activists or farmers, etc. may lead to higher government expenditure. And we may get relaxations in the economy like lower taxes, lower interest rates to gain support before an election. But these things aren't viable in the long term. And we should remember from last year that Romer's new growth theory says that investment is more complex. Now we move on to government intervention to reduce inequality and poverty with Chapter 8. So poverty rates are the percentage of the population living below the poverty line. The Gini coefficient is the measure of income distribution, the deviation of actual income in a country from the line of absolute equality. So it's measured from 0 to 1. And the closer you are to 1, the more unequal the income distribution is. So fiscal policy tools like government expenditure and taxes can be used to reduce poverty and inequality. So in the short term, we have the national budget that influences the distribution of private earnings. And then in the long term, we have government expenditure and taxes that influence economic growth rates, investment in capital, and human capital. But now let's talk about primary income, YP, and secondary income, YS. So primary income is the personal income of the individual, household, or group, reflecting the actual income received in cash or in kind. And then secondary income is the primary income minus the direct taxes paid from the primary income plus the value of government services consumed, G. So YS, secondary income, is equal to the primary income, YP, minus TD, direct taxes, plus G, government expenditure. But now let's talk about changing the distribution of primary income. So these are policies aimed at reducing inequalities in primary income in a country, and they're often achieved through, first, regulation. For example, a minimum wage or BEE legislation, etc. And then we have spending programs. This could be wage subsidies to firms to encourage them to hire more unemployed people. And then we have tax expenditures. So these are upside down subsidies. For example, an employment tax incentive. So you get to reduce your tax payable if you hire young and less experienced people. But now let's talk about changing the distribution of secondary income. So these are policies aimed at ex post reducing disparities in primary income generated through market activities. First, we take a look at spending programs, so G, government expenditure. So cash transfer programs like grants, in-kind transfers like free or subsidized nutritional schemes in schools, and social services, education, health, free basic services like water and electricity to poorer communities. And lastly, we also have tax, or T, designing taxes that impose higher tax burdens on the richest income and assets. But this is only effective if the additional revenue is used to redistribute the income or poverty-reducing initiatives for the poor. Now let's take a look at the considerations for design and assessment of policies. Well, we have to look at if these policies achieve their aims or effectiveness, and how do these policies influence the behavior of the intended beneficiaries. In terms of the tax side, the effectiveness is determined by the extent to which the taxes are borne by the rich or affluent. Here there might be economic incidents or burden shifting. In terms of its general usefulness in alleviating poverty, we look at the structure of benefits, so the forms that these benefits take, in kind or cash. We also take a look at the quality of poverty-reducing initiatives. Then we also take a look at its ability to break intergenerational poverty cycles. So the benefits are also designed to prevent future generations from living in poverty. For example, the provision of better quality education. But now let's take a look at how the policies influence the behavior of beneficiaries. So poverty alleviation initiatives might have unintended and distortive impacts on society. Behavioral impacts mostly occur because of moral hazard, where beneficiaries of such assistance schemes don't provide for their own needs any longer or don't protect themselves against negative income shocks because they have access to these types of government assistance. For example, a wage subsidy for younger people may cause firms to replace present workforce with younger people, as these are subsidized. Or for example, cash transfers squandered by recipients instead of paying for food and tuition of their children. In terms of taxes for redistribution, it's entirely possible that the affluent could shift the tax burden effectively to the less affluent members of society. For example, a rich person may rent out their home to a less affluent or middle class person. Now let's talk about the targeting of government spending programs. So we take a look at design mechanisms for identifying those with the biggest need and then directing government benefits towards these people. So we have three broad targeting mechanisms. First, we have means testing, and this is using levels of income or wealth to identify poor individuals eligible for assistance or transfer. And this is used for grants for older people, child support grants, and disability grants. And then we have indicator targeting. Using indicators instead of disclosed means may be easier as a measure to identify beneficiaries. For example, indicators that are highly correlated with income, yet easier to identify or measure, like ownership of land, levels of education, age, etc. And then we have self-targeting. So this involves using requirements or offering benefits that are unattractive to the affluent. For example, public works programs that pay too little to attract anyone other than unskilled, unemployed people. The advantage of self-targeting is that it's unnecessary to spend resources on identifying beneficiaries. Let's talk a bit about the benefits and limits of targeting. Well, the obvious benefits is that there's budgetary savings and strengthening the poverty-reducing effects of government expenditure programs. Now let's take a deeper look into universal cash transfers. So on a graph, the pre-transfer income of citizens is arranged from Y min to Y max. The vertical axis shows post-transfer income, thus the horizontal or x-axis shows the pre-transfer income. You'll have two curves going upward like a supply curve representing the income change, and a flat horizontal line represented by Z. Line Z is the poverty line. All the individuals earning less are poor, so Y min to Y2. Pre-transfer income is represented by the line Y min, A, and D, and this is the curve at the bottom. Y min, A, and Z depicts the country's pre-transfer poverty gap. But then the government introduces a cash transfer amount of T, which is equal to the distance between C and Y min. It effectively moves everyone's income up to C, B, and E, which is the uppermost curve. But the poverty gap is still not completely eradicated, but it is smaller. So the poverty gap is C, Z, and B instead of Y min, A, and Z. The transfer is therefore too small to lift everyone out of poverty. So universal or non-targeted cash transfer programs cause substantial benefit leakage. So the benefit is extended to those who should not strictly qualify. So everyone that received the transfer whose pre-transfer income was not exactly at the Y1 level received more than was necessary to lift them from poverty. Beneficiaries may have also included non-poor people, so individuals whose pre-transfer incomes exceeded Y2. So benefit leakage is among the main reasons why cash transfer programs are often inadequate to eliminate poverty gaps. But now let's take a look at perfectly targeted cash transfer programs. Well, these cash transfer programs would match every individual's income with the exact difference between the poverty line and their individual pre-transfer incomes that were less than Y2. The result would be a perfectly needs-matched cash transfer to individuals and thus full eradication of the poverty gap, so absolutely no benefit leakage possible. However, it's difficult and expensive to determine every individual's poverty gap. Let's take a closer look at targeted cash transfers. While these attempt to avoid errors of exclusion, so type 1 errors, and errors of inclusion, so type 2 errors. As exact poverty gap targeting would be too expensive, countries use, for example, means testing. So like the graph before, we have two curves going upward, with the upper curve having a line going down. So the government introduces a cash transfer amount of T, which is equal to C and Y min. And this is to everyone below the poverty line. Because it avoids type 2 errors, it can make larger transfers to those qualifying according to the means test. So the means-tested cash transfer doesn't completely eliminate absolute poverty, but as a result of the remaining type 1 errors, it results in a comparatively smaller poverty gap of C, B, and Z. So with means-tested targeting, it still doesn't totally eradicate absolute poverty, but the poverty gap is still smaller than in the case of non-targeted cash transfer programs, so it's still better than universal cash transfers. However, those individuals that were formerly at income levels between Y1 and Y2 receive more than what's necessary to lift them from absolute poverty. This may also create perverse incentives as these individuals with pre-transfer income levels of between Y1 and Y2 are now able to work less as the transfer program has sufficiently supplemented their income. But now let's take a look at the cost of targeting. So first we have administrative costs. So the cost of identifying and monitoring the targeted population could be substantial, and a trade-off exists between the admin cost of targeting and the cost associated with poor targeting or universal coverage. Now let's take a look at incentive costs. So positive incentives could be food subsidy schemes at schools that may increase enrollment. Negative incentives, which are more common, could be people not wanting to work. So it has to do with work-leisure choices. And means-tested targeting may discourage saving for retirement. And moral hazard problems could lead to the non-productive use of time or other resources. For example, parents not adequately providing for children if they know that the state will through feeding programs. And then we take a look at the stigma costs. So this is the loss of self-esteem fostered among beneficiaries by societal negative attitudes. So empirical research has found that targeted transfer programs were more effective than universal cash transfer programs in general. And this was measured in terms of benefit ratios. And the benefit ratios are the share of program benefits to qualifying beneficiaries, or the share of qualifying beneficiaries to the total population. Universal cash transfers usually yield a benefit ratio of 1. So that means, for example, 40% of the population receives 40% of the benefit. Targeted transfers usually yield benefit ratios of more than 1. And that signals the more effective redistributive effects of targeted programs. Now let's talk about fiscal incidence. Well, this is a tool to evaluate the effectiveness of government policies to reduce inequality and poverty. It enables considerations of the impacts of tax burdens and expenditure programs by government, both in isolation for specific taxes or expenditure programs, and the collective impact of the redistributive policies on society. So the identification of beneficiaries and bearers of tax burdens are categorized in groups of income deciles or quintiles. But now let's take a look at the conceptual framework of fiscal incidence. Well, first we have market income. This is salaries and wages, income from capital or dividends, pensions, and this is essentially your primary income, YP. Once you subtract direct tax payments, you move on to net market income. So the net market income is the market income less personal tax payments and employee contributions to old age pension schemes. And then after adding direct cash and near cash transfers, you get disposable income. So the disposable income is the net market income with direct cash transfers added and near cash transfers such as free textbooks, food schemes at schools, etc. And then once you subtract indirect taxes and add indirect subsidies, you get your post-fiscal income. This is your disposable income plus net market income with direct cash transfers added and near cash transfers. And once you add in-kind transfers to your post-fiscal income, you get your final income. So your final income is your post-fiscal income plus in-kind transfers by the government, such as education and health services. So essentially, as your income usually decreases from market income to final income, via the government's redistributive interventions, the Gini coefficients decrease proportionally. So essentially, the income distribution becomes more equal as you go down from market income to final income. Now we move on to social insurance and social assistance with Chapter 9. So Social Security protects people against the effects of various contingencies like unemployment, retirement, etc. But now let's take a look at the two components of income security systems. Well, first is social insurance. And this is funded from mandatory contributions by workers and employers, for example, payroll taxes. And then we have social assistance. These are cash transfer programs funded from general tax revenues. And the eligibility isn't limited to those who've contributed. So even if you haven't contributed, you can still get it. For example, an elderly person's grant. But now let's talk a bit about social insurance. In terms of the income protection role of insurance, due to the law of diminishing marginal utility, individuals prefer to avoid fluctuations in income. So essentially, they derive more utility from a smooth path of consumption rather than a variable one. People want to insure against income losses caused by retirement, illness, job losses, etc. And when we talk about consumption smoothing, we mean that individuals reduce consumption in times of plenty to enable them to sustain their levels of consumption in times of economic hardship. And insurance provided by the government prevents insurers from determining actuarially unfair premiums to cover against certain kinds of income losses. But let's talk about the information asymmetries in social insurance. Well, first we have adverse selection. Individuals with a high probability to suffer losses will be more keen to insure themselves, while at the same time hiding their risks from insurers. For example, unemployment insurance. Those with a high chance of unemployment will pay a disproportionately low premium and vice versa. Another information asymmetry we have is moral hazard. So once insured, individuals may act in ways that may increase the probabilities of the occurrence of the insured losses. For example, if an individual knows they're insured against unemployment loss, they may consciously behave in a manner that would trigger that loss. For example, not performing at work. Adverse selection is an information asymmetry that exists before the occurrence of obtaining insurance, whereas moral hazard is an asymmetry that occurs after getting the insurance. So government intervention is thus required to overcome the efficiency-related insurance market failures. So it enables both high and low-risk workers to join a social insurance scheme. In terms of equity considerations, social insurance offers better outcomes than private insurance. Mandatory social insurance schemes can collect payroll taxes from all employees and mobilize sufficient funds to provide insurance to those who can't afford full insurance against, for example, job losses on their own. But now let's talk about social assistance. So remember, this is non-contributory, so it's grants. And these focus on three vulnerable groups: children, the elderly, and the disabled. And social insurance is often justified with livelihood protection effects, which is essentially poorer people's ability to maintain minimum standards of living. Social assistance could also be important for livelihood promotion of these vulnerable groups if the programs invest in education, healthcare, and nutrition, etc. But what are the big risks with grants? While they could be squandered on luxuries, alcohol, etc., they could also be used for consumption smoothing instead of livelihood promotion. So social assistance programs could either take the form of cash transfers or in-kind transfers. In-kind transfers being the direct provision of goods and services like food, housing, etc., or subsidizing the prices of goods and services. Governments often prefer providing in-kind transfers to avoid misspending. The core argument in favor of cash transfers is that recipients that are able to choose how they spend their social assistance benefits can attain higher levels of utility than those who are given goods and services selected by government officials. So in terms of in-kind versus cash transfers, you'll have a graph with the quantity of food on the x-axis and the quantity of other goods and services on the y-axis. We have what essentially looks like two demand curves going downward, one curve being above another, and that seemed to be attached by the horizontal line AC. We have an initial equilibrium at E1 with individuals' expenditure on food at QF1 and their expenditure on other goods and services at Q01. And that corresponds to where the equilibrium curve E1 is tangent to AB. The government then introduces a social assistance scheme in the form of food parcels, in kind, to the value of QF2 to low-income households. In-kind transfers enable recipients to consume more, which is equivalent to an outward shift in the budget line. The recipient's cash, however, stays unchanged, and the absolute maximum of other goods and services they can afford is Q02. So the line ACD will represent the budget constraint after the in-kind transfer. But the recipient is better off than before the transfer. They're now on I2 at an equilibrium of E2, where they now consume more of both products. However, the consumer would have preferred to consume at equilibrium E3 had they been given the equivalent cash amount to consume anywhere on the hypothetical budget line ECD. So unlike the cash transfers, the in-kind transfer leaves the individual at a suboptimal level of E2 rather than the preferred equilibrium of E3. But then it's not universally true that cash transfers have better outcomes. There's costly targeting, means testing involved with cash transfers, and policymakers may find it easier to mobilize funds for in-kind transfers from donors. Beneficiaries are unlikely to squander cash transfers on luxury goods though. There's little empirical evidence of this, especially if beneficiaries are female. The government can't prevent the abuse of such transfers by giving in-kind transfers. The beneficiaries could always sell the goods and use the money for other expenses. But now let's talk about conditional cash transfer programs, or CCT programs. So these are cash transfers that are only given to households that meet certain requirements, like ensuring that their children attend school regularly, or that the household attends regular health checkups. So conditional cash transfer programs are designed to combat current poverty by providing income support to enable consumption smoothing. So this is livelihood protection. It also combats future poverty by attaching the transfer to conditions that would enhance human capital investment into future generations. So livelihood enhancement. But now let's take a look at the two considerations used to justify the imposition of behavioral conditions. Well, we have efficiency-related market failures, and we also have equity-related targeting considerations. So in terms of efficiency-related market failures, the marginal social benefit of investment in education or health exceeds the marginal private cost. People or parents may not realize this though, and this is an externality. In such cases, the conditional cash transfer program can overcome this externality by increasing investment in human capital of children. Now, in terms of equity-related targeting, conditional cash transfer programs are effectively used where means testing isn't feasible. They impose conditions that would make redistribution automatically more equitable. Policymakers should be careful not to set conditions for such a grant at a level that the poor find too onerous, as this might cause the entire transfer to be ineffective, so it shouldn't be too much work. But now let's talk about the incentive effects of income protection systems. While cash transfer programs could alter behavior of beneficiaries in ways that may undermine poverty alleviation and the cost-effectiveness of such interventions, for example, the moral hazard associated with these social insurance schemes. Now let's take a look at universal income grants financed from tax revenue. So a universal income grant is a cash transfer to all citizens irrespective of age or economic status. This may erode work effort though. So on a graph, you'll have the income per day on the y-axis and the hours per day on the x-axis. You'll have three budget lines, each with their own equilibrium. So at the initial equilibrium, the person's budget constraint, BA, is tangent to the individual's indifference curve, I0. The individual works AC hours and gets 0C hours of leisure in order to consume 0D. With an income transfer by the government, it raises the budgetary individual's constraint from BA to GF. By raising income through the transfer, so the higher budget line at GF, it enables the individual to consume at E1 with 0J consumption. However, work effort is also reduced to AH. Leisure thus increased from 0C to 0H. After the income transfer, the individual experiences a higher level of welfare. They consume more but also work less hours. If an income tax is now imposed to finance the cash transfer, the opportunity cost of leisure would increase, causing BL to swivel inwards to KF. The individual is now on a lower level of welfare, I2 instead of I1. The equilibrium is now at E2, but they now work even less hours than AL. Thus, income tax financed cash transfers reduces incentives to work in two ways. First is the negative income effect of the transfer, shown by HC, and then the negative combined income and substitution effects of tax, shown by LH. Another example could be old age pension schemes. For example, if you earn $2,400, you'll receive full social assistance of $1,600 per month. But any person who earns more than $3,600 wouldn't qualify for any social assistance. So essentially, a person earning $3,601 per month would be almost 400 Rand worse off. So for any person earning between $2,400 and $3,600 per month, the grant will decrease by 1 Rand for every Rand earned above $2,400. So the total amount you could earn is effectively capped at $4,000. So there are sliding scale benefits. So if we had to look at this on a graph, we'd have the total income per month on the y-axis and the non-pension income per month on the x-axis. So to illustrate the disincentive effect of the means-tested targeting for old age pensions, we have two curves going upward, with the upper curve breaking off and becoming horizontal at CD. So we have a sliding scale old age pension assistance of $1,600 per month. This is for individuals with non-pension incomes NPI between 0 and 2,400 Rand per month. And this is the distance BC. And as said before, individuals with non-pension incomes between 2,400 and 3,600 receive 1 Rand less for every 1 Rand earned above 2,400 Rand per month. So this is the distance CD. And again, the total income is effectively capped at 4,000 Rand. Any individuals earning a non-pension income of above 3,600 Rand receives no social assistance. So this is the distance DE. So their total income effectively drops off to 3,601 per month. Thus, individuals earning a non-pension income of between 3,601 per month and 3,999 per month are therefore worse off than those earning a non-pension income of 3,600 per month. So the design of the means test could disincentivize those potentially falling in the distance EF from saving for their old age. But now let's take a high-level look at the South African income security system. Well, in terms of social insurance, we have the Unemployment Insurance Fund, Compensation Funds, and the Road Accident Fund. They're all funded from workers, employees, and road users, and the financing mechanism is payroll taxes and fuel levies. And then we move on to social assistance. This includes the child support grant, the care dependency grant, the foster care grant, disability grant, old age pension, war veterans grant, and grant in aid. This is funded from workers, employers, and other taxpayers. And the financing mechanism is other taxes. And then we have occupational insurance. This includes retirement funds, medical schemes, etc. Again, this is funded by workers and employers. The financing mechanism is contributions. Now we move on to social services with Chapter 10. So first we take a look at education. Well, it provides various external benefits, but individuals are unlikely to take these societal benefits into consideration when making the decision to invest in human capital. So the direct costs would be tuition fees, books, transport, accommodation, etc. And then the indirect or opportunity cost would be earnings foregone while accumulating the human capital, so studying. So in terms of an educated worker, we'll have a graph with their income on the y-axis and their age on the x-axis. And as you'll see, their income will be negative for a bit and then it shoots up and then stagnates after a while. So the person with education goes to school from age 6 and enters the job market at the age of 22. They incur the direct and indirect costs of schooling and their earnings curve remains negative for the entire school-going age. However, once these individuals enter the job market after obtaining the tertiary qualification, their earnings exceed that of uneducated people and the rate of wage growth is also much higher than in the case of uneducated people. Then in terms of an uneducated worker, their graph will be linear, as opposed to the more exponential one for the educated worker. So the person that receives no schooling starts work at a relatively young age. Pay, however, stays relatively low. They start working at age 6 and retire at age 62. These people avoid the direct and indirect opportunity cost of education, and they have a relatively long working career. Yet their salary growth remains low due to lack of qualifications. So several young people, their parents or guardians don't have sufficient information to conduct the proper cost-benefit analysis of the benefits of education. Information constraints provide ample basis for education being considered by government as a merit good. Government provides these merit goods with a combination of education subsidies, but also regulation making child labor illegal. Capital market structures are also often inadequate to provide infrastructure for education, which is another justification for government intervention. But let's take a look at the equity argument for education. Well, it argues that a better trained society also contributes more to the tax revenue pool, thus enabling better achievement potential of income redistribution. But now let's take a look at healthcare. While externalities and imperfect information causes allocative inefficiency in unregulated healthcare markets, and this prompts government intervention. Unregulated markets will typically underprovide and underprice goods and services with positive externalities. The government regulates on the supply side in an effort to ensure quality of healthcare provided in a country. For example, training and accreditation to overcome information asymmetries. On the demand side, information constraints make the demand for healthcare also prone to market failures of adverse selection and moral hazard. Moral hazard is a concern with medical insurance, as people may be careless with health-related issues if they know they're insured against any medical costs they may incur. But now let's take a look at the third-party payment problem in healthcare insurance. So on the y-axis you'll have prices and on the x-axis you'll have the quantity. Initial equilibrium is at a point with individuals' demand for medical services at Q0 and P0. Total expenditure on medical services amounts to P0, A, and Q0. Individuals with healthcare expenditure insurance aren't required to pay service providers in full. Most will be paid by the insurance providers. Medical aid reduces payments from P0 to P1. Consequently, the quantity consumed by insured individuals increase from Q0 to Q1. Medical aids may still require co-payments though. And these are smaller amounts that the individual still needs to pay to curb their unnecessary and excessively expensive medical care. So the total expenditure of the co-payments on medical services by individuals amount to P1, B, Q1, and 0. And this is substantially less than before medical insurance, so P0A, Q00. The effective medical insurance also impacts the supply side. The supply is also required to increase to meet the higher demand at Q1. In this case, the total expenditure for healthcare services increased to P2C Q10 from P0A Q00. That includes the individual's co-payments and the medical aids payments. And that's with medical aids paying P2C B P1 and consumers paying P1 B Q10. You should also take note that the marginal cost exceeds the marginal benefit along the segments between Q0 and Q1. And as a consequence, the triangle ABC represents the allocative inefficiency caused by the third-party payment problem. So social, as opposed to private insurance schemes, could overcome this adverse selection problem, while also addressing equity problems, making healthcare available to everyone instead of only those who can afford private medical insurance. So social healthcare insurance schemes are costly and administratively complex. They'd have to be funded from the tax revenue on a national basis, and usually through payroll taxes. But now let's take a look at the case for in-kind transfers. While in-kind subsidies provide social services either for free or at a nominal fee to qualifying beneficiaries, the economic justification for in-kind subsidies is that the cost of subsidies often exceed their benefits. In such cases, the subsidies give rise to excess burden which signal economic inefficiencies. Now let's take a look at a graph that illustrates the excess burden of an in-kind subsidy. Well, you'll have the price on the y-axis and the quantity on the x-axis. You'll have what looks like a demand curve that goes down and then kind of flattens out at the end. And then you'll have a flat horizontal supply curve which is equal to the price and the marginal cost. Where they both intersect represents the equilibrium E0 with the price of P0 and a quantity of Q0. So this is a market for social services with an initial equilibrium at E0 with Q1 and P1. Suppose the government wants to encourage the use of educational services. Well, they could do this by subsidizing the provision of such a social service. The assumption here though is that the marginal cost of producing extra of this service is constant. So it's a horizontal supply curve. The full subsidy is passed on to consumers, so the price reduces with the full amount of the subsidy. So the price due to the subsidy of educational services decreases to P1 and consequently Q1 is consumed by the public. The extra benefit due to the subsidy is measured in terms of the increased consumer surplus, which is the area P0, E0, E1 and P1. The full cost of the subsidy and thus the decrease in government resources is, however, P0, B, E1, and P1. The difference, which is the area E0, B, and E1, is the excess burden or the deadweight loss of the subsidy. The above excess burden of this in-kind subsidy represents a net welfare loss to society due to the existence of the subsidy. This doesn't mean that the provision of in-kind transfers are never justified. A good case can be made for providing social services such as education and medical services in the form of in-kind transfers with the positive externalities associated with them, like TB treatment. But now let's take a look at a graph illustrating the subsidization and external benefits of tuberculosis treatment. So this is about internalizing the external benefits. So you'll have three demand curves going downward, the lowest one being the marginal external benefit, the one in the middle being the marginal private benefit, and the one at the very top and the longest one being the marginal social benefit. You'll also have a flat horizontal supply curve, which is also the marginal cost. The point at which the marginal cost curve intersects the marginal social benefit represents the first equilibrium E1, and this corresponds to the price P0 and the quantity Q1. Where the marginal cost curve intersects the marginal private benefit is the equilibrium E0, which corresponds to the price P0 and the quantity Q0. The second equilibrium E2 is found on the marginal private benefit curve, and it corresponds to the first equilibrium E1. Because of the positive external benefits to society because of TB treatment, the marginal social benefit is larger than the marginal private benefit. The marginal social benefit is the vertical summation of the marginal external cost and the marginal private benefit. So the marginal social benefit is equal to the marginal private benefit plus the marginal external benefit. And again, the assumption here is that the marginal cost of producing extra of this service is constant. So we have a horizontal supply curve, and it happens to be equal to the competitive market price of P0. From a societal point of view, the optimal consumption would be at Q1. The individual will only consume at Q0 where their marginal private benefit is equal to the marginal social cost. In-kind subsidies would internalize this external benefit, and they do this by lowering the effective price to P1, thus also encouraging consumption at a socially optimal level of Q1. The size of the required subsidy is the area P0, E1, E2, and P1. So in conclusion, an in-kind subsidy will encourage consumption at a level of Q1, thereby ensuring optimal benefits for both the individual and society. So in-kind subsidies are likely to give rise to larger increases of consumption of products or services that display a positive consumption externality, rather than unconditional cash transfers. But now let's talk a bit about social service delivery. While in terms of the public provision of education and healthcare in South Africa, while our government spending on education and healthcare is high by international standards, and it's well targeted at the poor. But now let's take a look at reasons why links in service delivery chains break down. Well, it could be corruption, weak accountability mechanisms, and weaknesses in the capacities to budget, disburse allocated funds, and monitor program implementation. But we need to remember that there's an important distinction between outputs and outcomes. Outputs are easily observed, counted, and verified deliverables that tend to be the intermediary aims of programs. Outcomes, however, are deliverables that are more difficult to observe, count, and verify. and yet they're linked to the ultimate program goals. The pro-poor resource shifts since 1994 have been accompanied by improvements in educational outputs, but improvements in educational outcomes have not been forthcoming. Let's take a look at the service delivery issues in education in South Africa. While the service delivery chain problems contributed a lot to the poor educational outcomes in South Africa, let's take a look at the 4 binding constraints on the optimal use of resources. Well, first is weaknesses in the provincial educational departments. And then we have the undue influence of labor unions. And then the weak content knowledge and pedagogical skills of teachers. And lastly, the wasted learning time. And a lot of these problems are related to the lack of accountability. There are few, if any, consequences for poor performance. And now in terms of access to and quality of health services in South Africa, public health care seems to be an inferior good in South Africa. This is to say that the demand decreases as income increases. Given the level of resources, poor outcomes seem to reflect widespread technical inefficiency or inefficiency. Now we move on to the introduction to tax and tax equity with Chapter 11. So what are the sources of government revenue? Well, first we have taxation, and this is the dominant source of finance. And then we have user charges or benefit taxes. Well, here prices are charged for the delivery of certain public goods and services. And user charges can only be levied if exclusion is possible. So it should be possible to exclude those who didn't pay for the consumption of the good. Examples are toll roads, public swimming pools, university education, etc. Another source of government revenue is administrative fees. Admin fees are similar to user charges, but the service or benefit received in return for the fee is defined broadly or imprecisely. For example, business licenses, TV licenses, motor vehicle licenses, etc. Another source is government borrowing. So the government can borrow from its citizens or from abroad. And this is often used to finance capital expenditure. The borrowed funds must be repaid at some point and can therefore amount to deferred taxes. And another source of government revenue is government-induced inflation or inflation tax. If public expenditure is financed in such a way that increases the money supply, this financing may raise the price level. Inflation changes the real value of public debt. But what are taxes? Well, taxes are transfers of resources from persons or economic units to government and are compulsory or legally enforceable. And there's not necessarily a direct connection between the resources transferred to government and the goods and services it supplies. So just because you pay 10 Rand in taxes doesn't mean you'll directly get anything back. But the government doesn't have unlimited powers and are still subject to the Constitution. Taxes can generally be imposed on 3 tax bases. The tax bases in question is income, wealth, consumption or sales and transactions, and maybe a tax on people, so lump sum or poll tax. But what are flows and stocks? Well, flows are associated with a time dimension and are measured over a period. For example, income and consumption. Stocks have no time dimension and are measured at a particular point in time. For example, wealth. The tax rate is the amount of tax levied per unit of the tax base. But now let's take a look at different tax rate structures. Well, first we have a proportional tax rate. This is when the average tax rate remains constant with respect to variations in the tax base. So here you pay the same amount of tax regardless of how much you make. And then we have the progressive tax rate. This is when the average tax rate increases as the tax base increases. So here you pay more tax the more you earn. And then we have the regressive tax rate. So here the average tax rate decreases as the tax base increases. So here you pay less tax the more you earn. But now let's differentiate between general and selective taxes. So general taxes or broad-based taxes taxes the entire base and allows for no exemptions. For example, VAT. They're similar to head or lump sum taxes, which leave relative prices unchanged. And here the behavior of economic role players is assumed to be unaffected. In terms of selective taxes or narrow-based taxes, these are imposed on one or a few products. For example, a tax on wage income excluding interest income, or excise taxes on cigarettes. These types of taxes distort relative prices. There's a before and after tax price on a commodity. But what about specific and ad valorem taxes? Well, a specific or unit tax is when a fixed amount is imposed per unit of the product. For example, 2 Rand for every 340 milliliter can of malt beer, or maybe a 5 Rand tax on every 20 cigarettes. But then ad valorem taxes are taxes imposed on the value of the product, and this is usually levied as a rate. So a percentage of the price of the good, for example VAT, excise taxes, etc. But what about direct versus indirect taxes? Well, direct taxes are imposed directly on the individuals and companies. For example, personal income tax and company tax. And this type of tax can't be shifted readily. And then indirect taxes are imposed on commodities. For for example excise taxes and VAT. These types of taxes are likely to be shifted. But what are the properties of a good tax? Well, first is equity. It should promote an equitable or fair distribution of income. And then we have economic efficiency. They should be designed in a way that their distorting effects on the choices made by taxpayers are minimized. Another property of a good tax is administrative efficiency. Admin and compliance costs have to be kept low, so simple and certain. And then we have flexibility. As economic circumstances change, the tax and tax rates need to adjust. So they need to be able to facilitate macroeconomic stability. But now we move on to taxation and equity. So fairness is a value-laden concept. Adam Smith said that everyone should help pay for government depending on how much money they have. And if they have more money, they should give more since the government helps protect their money. So in terms of taxation and equity, we look at the benefit principle and the ability to pay principle. So the benefit principle stipulates that the tax burden of government expenditure should be apportioned to taxpayers in accordance with the benefits each receives. And this is to avoid forced carrying. And forced carrying is when someone is being made to carry a heavier than proper tax burden. But remember, free riding is when someone is failing to carry a proper tax burden. And then in terms of the ability to pay principle, it calls for people with equal capacity to pay the same amount of tax. So horizontal equity. And it also calls for people with greater capacity to pay more, so vertical equity. So here, the total cost of public spending must be apportioned according to the ability of people to pay, and the taxes aren't linked to government expenditure. And income is by no means a perfect measure of a person's ability to pay though. Now let's take a look at partial equilibrium analysis of tax incidence. Well, tax incidence is a tool used to assess the ultimate impact of taxes on taxpayers. So it assesses the fairness of the tax. And partial equilibrium analysis is the analysis of tax incidence in just one market. It's not concerned with how the tax affects other markets. Now let's take a look at the incidence of a unit tax. So a unit tax is a fixed amount instead of a percentage of the price of the product. The tax will be the same at all prices of the commodity. And it'll be a parallel shift. So on a graph, you'll have the price of bread on the y-axis and the quantity of bread on the x-axis. Two supply curves going upward and a demand curve going down. And as you can see, the supply curve shifts upward parallel after the imposition of a tax. So here we have a statutory burden of tax on the seller. The initial equilibrium before the taxes is X, and this is where the supply and demand S0 and D0 meet. And they have a corresponding quantity and price of Q0 and P0. Now a unit tax is levied and this shifts the supply curve S0 parallel up to S1. The vertical distance between S1 and S0 is equal to the tax. A new market equilibrium is formed at A, and this is where S1 intersects D0. The price for consumers increases from P0 to PM, and the price for the seller decreases from P0 to PS. Government revenue is equal to PM, A, C, and PS. PM, A, B, P0 is the contribution of consumers or the consumer surplus. And then P0, B, C, PS is the contribution of producers. The economic incidence of this tax is shared by suppliers and consumers, even though the statutory incidence is only on suppliers. But now let's take a look at when the statutory burden is on buyers. Well, the demand curve shifts down from D0 to D1. There is a new market equilibrium at C, and the price for buyers increases from P0 to PM, and the price for sellers decreases from P0 to PS. Government revenue is the area PM, A, C, and PS, and the contribution of consumers to government revenue is PM, A, B, and P0. And then the contribution of suppliers is P0, B, C, and PS. So as you can see, consumers contribute more to government revenue. But again, the economic incidence of the tax is shared by suppliers and consumers, and this is despite the statutory incidence being only on consumers. But now let's take a look at the incidence of an ad valorem tax. Well, since it's an ad valorem tax, there's non-parallel shift, so it swivels. And let's say, for example, the statutory incidence is on suppliers. So it means the supply curve will be the one moving. And we'll have the price on the y-axis and the quantity on the x-axis. We'll have one demand curve going downward, D0, and two supply curves going up. So here they impose a tax and the statutory burden is on the seller. And the supply curve S0 swivels up to S1. The tax is proportional. And of course, the distance between S0 and S1 is the amount of the tax. If you compare the tax payable at PH, which is DE, to the tax payable at PI, FG, you'll see that the tax payable at PI is much smaller than the one at PH. So a lower price, P1, means the tax is much smaller. After the supply curve swivels up to S1, there's a new market equilibrium at A. The price for buyers increases from P0 to PM, and the size of the burden is PM, A, B, and P0. And then the price for sellers decreases from P0 to PS. And again, the burden is P0, B, C, and PS. And then the total burden would be the sum of those burdens, so PM, A, C, and PS. And the size of the ad valorem tax is bigger when prices are higher. But now let's take a look at incidence and the elasticities of demand and supply. Well, on the graph you'll have the price on the y-axis and the quantity on the x-axis. Two supply curves going upward and two demand curves, one of which becomes more inelastic or becomes more vertical. So there's two demand curves, D0 and D1. The before tax price is P0 irrespective of demand. The market equilibrium is at X where it intersects with S0. D1 is less elastic than D0. The quantity for D1 is less responsive to changes in price. But now at the same time a unit tax is imposed on the importer or supplier. This leads to a parallel shift in S. So S0 shifts up to S. If on D1 we have a new equilibrium at C, the price for buyers increases from P0 to P1, and the price for sellers decreases from P0 to P2. Government revenue is P1, C, F, P2, assuming this inelastic demand. And the contribution of consumers is P1, C, D, P0, and the contribution of suppliers is P0, D, F, P2. So with inelastic demand, the consumer's share of the tax burden is larger than suppliers, even though the statutory incidence is on suppliers. If the unit tax is imposed on the supplier or importer, S0 will shift up to S1, but assuming the price elasticity of demand stays the same, we'll reach a new equilibrium at A. And here the price for buyers increases from P0 to P3, and the price for sellers decreases from P0 to P4. Government revenue here is P3, A, B, and P4. The contribution of consumers is P3, A, E, P0, and the contribution of suppliers is P0, E, B, and P4. So when comparing the demand curve D1 to D0, we see that the more price elastic demand is, the greater the revenue obtained by government. So you compare P1, C, F, P2 to P3, A, B, and P4. Now let's do a general equilibrium analysis of tax incidence. Well, you have two graphs, one for shoes, which is capital intensive, and one for baskets, which is labor intensive. And of course, we have the price on the y-axis and the quantity on the x-axis. So let's take a look at if we have a selective tax on commodities. Let's say there's a tax imposed on shoes. Well, the price of shoes rises, so the supply curve will shift upward, leading to an increased price and a decrease in quantity. The after-tax price of the shoes doesn't necessarily rise by the full amount of the tax. It's shared by the producers and consumers depending on the elasticities of demand and supply. The price increase has two effects. It affects users on the demand side, and it affects the production factors used in the production of shoes. On the user side, the relative price increase of shoes results in consumers demanding fewer shoes and more baskets, so there's substitute consumption. The demand for baskets increases and the demand curve shifts outward. Thus, the price of baskets rises and the quantity of baskets also rises. So the selective tax on shoes causes an increase in the prices of both products. There are shifts in both the taxed and the non-taxed market. The tax burden and tax incidence spreads to the consumers and producers of the non-taxed product. Now, when we look at the production factor market, there are fewer shoes demanded, and thus fewer produced. Shoes are capital intensive, so more capital than labor is released into the market. The redundant labor and capital must now find employment in the sector manufacturing the baskets. Baskets are labor intensive and capital can't be absorbed. And since there's excess capital, the relative price will decrease to compete with labor. So the tax will decrease the relative price of capital. But what would happen if we had a general tax on both commodities? Well, if we had a tax imposed on shoes and reed baskets simultaneously at the same rate, the general tax would leave relative prices unchanged. So it triggers no substitution in consumption, it triggers no substitution in production, so it leaves the relative prices of factors of production unchanged, and it leaves the allocation of factors of production unchanged. So each citizen shares in the tax burden in proportion to their consumption of the taxed commodities. Now we move on to tax efficiency, administrative efficiency, and flexibility with Chapter 12. So what do we mean when we talk about excess burden of taxation? Well, these are taxes that cause a burden that's greater than what's necessary to generate a certain amount of tax revenue. This is in addition to the direct tax. And the theory of excess burden of different taxes can be explained using two approaches: the indifference curve approach and the consumer surplus approach. Well, with the consumer surplus approach, you'd have the price on the y-axis and the quantity on the x-axis, a demand curve going downward and a supply curve going up, which is S0. Let's say, for example, a unit tax is imposed and the supply curve shifts upward from S0 to S1. The price would increase from P0 to PM, and the consumer surplus would decrease, and the price for producers would decrease from P0 to PS. Total government revenue would be that whole rectangle from PM to PS. The supply shifting upward also leads to the quantity decreasing, and the triangle that forms between Q1 and Q0 is the deadweight loss, or the excess burden. So using the consumer surplus approach, we have the price of butter on the y-axis and the quantity on the x-axis. So we have an initial equilibrium price at PB and an equilibrium quantity at Q2. This is where the flat supply curve intersects with D0. Now a selective tax is imposed on the price of product B. The price thus increases to 1 plus T PB and the new quantities at Q1. The supply curve S0 shifts parallel upwards to S1. The quantity obviously decreases, and the consumer surplus decreases from ACE to ABF. The area FBCE is forfeited in terms of consumer surplus, and the tax revenue paid to government is BDEF. And the triangle BCD is the welfare loss. But now let's differentiate between lump sum taxes and general taxes. So a lump sum tax is a fixed amount that an individual would have to pay in a fiscal year, and it's independent of income, wealth, or consumption. These taxes don't distort prices and they don't affect people's consumption decisions. They have no substitution effect. They can't be shifted and there's no excess burden. These lump sum taxes reduces everyone's disposable income, so it has an income effect. A disadvantage though is that lump sum taxes are regressive in nature. But what about selective taxes? While these tax only a part of the general tax base, it doesn't affect the tax base the same, so it's a non-neutral tax. It changes and distorts relative prices, so it affects the choices of taxpayers. But now let's take a look at the excess burden of a tax using indifference curves. Well, on a graph you'll have the quantity of good Y on the y-axis and the quantity of good X on the x-axis. You'll have three budget lines, two of them having the same gradient, and then one with a steeper gradient stemming from the uppermost budget line. So before the tax, the budget line is the line AB, with the first equilibrium being at E0, with the curve U0 being tangent to the line AB. A lump sum tax is then introduced and the line AB shifts backward to CD. It's a parallel shift, so relative prices remain unchanged. The revenue for the tax is AC for Y and DB for X. There's a new consumer equilibrium at E1. Less of product Y and X is consumed than before. Consumers are thus worse off than before, and they're on a lower indifference curve of U1. So after the tax, there's no substitution effect, and there's no excess burden or deadweight loss. But now, what if we impose a selective tax? So here we compare the impact of a selective tax to that of a lump sum tax that generates the same tax revenue. And to obtain the after-tax budget line after the selective tax, which yields the same revenue as the lump sum tax, we must find an equilibrium point that's also on the budget line CD, or the budget line after the lump sum tax was induced. So there's a selective tax on one product, and it produces the same revenue as the lump sum tax. We have an initial equilibrium at E0 with AB being tangent to U0. A selective tax is then introduced to the price of product X, so AB swivels inwards to AF, and this distorts relative prices, and the revenue from the selective tax is the same as the lump sum tax. So the distance between the equilibrium E2 and G being equal to the distance between A and C. So a new consumer equilibrium forms at E2, and the consumer is worse off than before. The indifference curve U2 is lower than U1 for the same revenue, and the difference in welfare equates to the welfare cost or excess burden of a selective tax. So that's the distance between U2 and U1. But now let's talk about tax neutrality. So tax neutrality in the traditional or narrow context says that taxes should not prevent consumers from maximizing utility or producers from maximizing profit. But in the modern or broader context, due to market imperfections, taxes are inefficient and inequitable, so we have non-neutral taxes. Non-neutral taxes can be beneficial or harmful depending on whether they steer the economy towards or away from optimality. So positive non-neutral taxes steer the economy closer to optimality. So it uses the tax distortion to offset a pre-existing market inefficiency. But with a negative non-neutral tax, it steers the economy away from optimality, and it exacerbates market inefficiencies. But now let's take a look at the effective demand elasticity on excess burden. Well, the size of the deadweight loss or excess burden is influenced by, first, the size of the tax, then the price elasticities of supply and demand, and then the price times the quantity, so the amount spent on the commodity before tax. And remember, with inelastic demand, consumers don't adjust quantities in response to price changes, so the deadweight loss is smaller. So on a graph, you'll have the price of butter on the y-axis and the quantity on the x-axis. You'll have two flat supply curves and two demand curves, D0 being relatively elastic and D1 being relatively inelastic, so it's more vertical. So let's say a selective tax T is imposed on the price of butter, while having an inelastic demand curve at D1. So the price increases to 1 plus Tp with the new quantity at Q2. The supply curve S0 shifts parallel upwards to S1. The excess burden is the area G, C, and H. The excess burden, if the demand was more elastic at D0, is B, C, and D. So as we can see, the excess burden is smaller when we have more inelastic demand curves. So the causes of the excess burden is the substitutions caused by the price distortions introduced by the taxes. When these substitutions get larger, the demand is more elastic, and high demand elasticities are associated with larger substitutions in consumption and a bigger excess burden or deadweight loss. So levying taxes on price and elastic demand curves is more efficient, so there's lower excess burden. So but what is the Ramsey rule or the inverse elasticity rule? Well, it says that commodity taxes should be high on demand inelastic commodities, and they should be low on demand elastic commodities. And this is done for efficiency purposes. And as we know, demand is inelastic for necessity goods and elastic for luxury goods. So to calculate the magnitude of the excess burden, the price elasticity of demand is equal to the change in quantity divided by the quantity divided by the change in price divided by the price. This then leads us to another equation where the change in quantity is equal to the price elasticity of demand multiplied by the price in brackets PT, and this multiplied by the quantity divided by the price. And then finally, the excess burden EB is equal to half times the price elasticity of demand multiplied by T to the power of 2 multiplied by P times Q. So it's essentially the area of a triangle. So if the value of the price elasticity of demand is low, the excess burden is small, so demand is price inelastic. But if the value is high, the excess burden is large, so demand is price elastic. But now let's take a look at tax rates and excess burden. Well, again, we'll have the price on the y-axis and the quantity on the x-axis. On the graph, we'll have a demand curve going downward and three flat supply curves moving parallel upwards from S0 to S2. So first we have an initial equilibrium at C, and the equilibrium price is at PB and Q0. And there we have the lowest supply curve at S0. So a selective tax T2 is imposed on PB, and the price increases to 1 plus T2 PB, and a new quantity forms at Q2. So S0 shifts parallel upwards to S2. The excess burden in this case is A, C, and H, and the tax revenue in this case is G, A, H, and E. But then suppose the selective tax is halved to T1. Well, then the price would drop to 1 plus T1 PB, and the new quantity would be at Q1. So the tax rate was halved, but the revenue isn't halved. And the revenue in this case is F, B, D, and E. And the excess burden in this case would be B, C, and D. So the excess burden shrinks. The area of the trapezium A, B, D, and H represents the reduction in the deadweight loss when the tax is halved. So we should know that high taxes cause much larger inefficiencies and welfare losses than low taxes. So the revenue obtained by a higher tax isn't much higher than from a lower tax. The efficiency loss ratio would be the excess burden divided by the tax revenue. So economic efficiency could be improved by reducing taxes on goods and services with high efficiency loss ratios and increasing taxes on goods and services with low efficiency loss ratios. But now let's talk a bit about administrative efficiency. So this is all about minimizing the cost for the tax authorities and individual taxpayers. So the costs of tax include the compliance costs for individual taxpayers and the admin costs of tax. So certainty and simplicity in the tax system helps taxpayers keep compliance costs low. So but what is tax avoidance? Well, this is legal and it's taking advantage of special provisions or tax loopholes. It has opportunity costs though. Large businesses are split into smaller units to take advantage of beneficial company tax provisions. But now what's tax evasion? Well, now this is illegal and this is contravening tax laws to pay less or no tax. This might be the underreporting of income and claiming more deductions. So the aim of tax authorities is to keep tax avoidance and evasion to a minimum. But now what is the tax gap? Well, this is the difference between the tax liability declared to authorities, so the actual revenue collected, and the tax base calculated, so the expected tax revenue. So it's the difference between the actual revenue collected and the expected revenue. So factors affecting the tax gap include tax illiteracy, cultural attitudes, the level of tax morality, so the willingness to pay tax, and tax legislation. And we should know that the willingness to pay or tax morality is linked to perceptions of horizontal and vertical equity, and the way in which revenue is spent. If taxpayers feel the tax system is inequitable and the government is being wasteful, the willingness to pay is undermined. Now we move on to personal income taxation with Chapter 13. So now let's talk a bit about the comprehensive income tax base. So income can be defined from a source or revenue perspective or from a use or expenditure perspective. And the formula for income is Y equals to C plus S, Y being income, C being consumption, and S being savings. And income obviously includes salaries, wages, interest, capital gains, profits, dividends, etc. And that is the Hague-Simmons definition of comprehensive income. And this reflects the ability to pay. And with the comprehensive approach to income, income is recorded when it accrues to the taxpayer, not only when it's realized. For example, the asset increases in value, and that is a capital gain or additional net worth. And here, the asset doesn't need to be sold or realized for the increases in value to be regarded as income. The increase in value of the asset is equal to an increase in the purchasing power of the owner, and that increases the ability to pay. But now let's take a look at international taxation of income. Well, there's two general principles, the residence of the taxpayer principle, which reflects the ability to pay principle, and the source of income principle, which reflects the benefit principle. In terms of the residence of the taxpayer principle, the country where the person lives receives the tax and determines the tax liability. It could also be known as the worldwide basis principle. For example, if you made 20 Rand in the UK and 50 Rand here in South Africa, you add them together and 70 Rand would be your total taxable income. Thus, a person residing in South Africa would be liable for taxes on their worldwide income, including the money made in South Africa. And then in terms of the source of income principle, income is taxed by the country where the income is generated. For example, if you made 20 Rand in the UK and 50 Rand in South Africa, only the 50 Rand would be taxable in South Africa and the 20 Rand would be taxed in the UK. From a tax neutrality point of view, a tax system shouldn't influence locational decisions of businesses. So from the perspective of a capital importing country, a source-based system would have the advantage of being neutral since it doesn't discriminate between domestic and foreign investment. From a capital exporting perspective, a residence-based system would be neutral. The only concern to the investor would be the tax rate in their country of residence. You should know a residence-based system was introduced in South Africa in 2001, mainly due to globalization, relaxed exchange controls, etc. Now let's take a look at the personal income tax base. Well, you should know that gross income is all the receipts and accruals, wages, salaries, rent, royalties, dividends, interest, etc., irrespective of where in the world the income is earned. So the comprehensive definition of income is much broader because the government provides tax expenditures or tax loopholes. So tax expenditures include exclusions, exemptions, deductions, and tax rebates or credit that affect the size of the tax base. But then what are exclusions, exemptions, and deductions? Well, exclusions are when the income isn't included in the tax base. In terms of exemptions, the income is included but it's made tax exempt. And then deductions are the expenditure items that you're permitted to deduct from your income. But then how do we go about calculating personal income tax liability? Well, first you have the total or comprehensive income, and then you subtract exclusions, and then we get the gross or cash income. And then from there you subtract exemptions, for example, the tax-free portion of interest. And then you get your net income. And then from there you subtract deductions, for example, contributions to retirement funds, medical expenses, etc. And then you get your taxable income. From there you're taxed according to tax tables. And then you get your gross tax liability. And then from there you subtract rebates or tax credits. And finally you get your net tax liability. So you should know that most countries apply the equal marginal sacrifice principle. Thus the income tax rate should increase progressively as taxable income increases. And the aim is to achieve a more equitable distribution of after-tax income. But now let's take a look at economic efficiency. While a general tax on income has no excess burden, for example, a head tax, but a selective tax on labor income, which is essentially a personal income tax, has an excess burden. Since leisure can't be taxed easily, a tax on income only is a selective tax. People may decide to work more or less because of the tax. The net effect depends on the relative strengths of the income and substitution effects of the price change. The substitution effect has an adverse effect on the incentive to work, and this is determined by the marginal tax rate. But now let's take a look at a graph illustrating the supply of labor and personal income tax. While on the y-axis you'll have the income, and on the x-axis you'll have leisure or work. Leisure is read from left to right on the x-axis, and then work effort is read from right to left. So first we have an initial equilibrium at E0 on U0, with 0Q0 hours spent on leisure and LQ0 hours worked. Now if we have a selective tax on labor income only, which is essentially a personal income tax, the tax distorts the relative prices of work and leisure. The budget line pivots from YL to BL, so it goes down, and the equilibrium moves from E0 to E1. The tax liability is E1G, the difference between the before tax and after tax income earned by working LQ1 hours. The movement from E0 to E1 is the combined effect of the imposition of the tax on income. The substitution effect is the movement from E0 to E2. On the horizontal axis, work hours now produce less income after the tax. Leisure hours are substituted for work hours, indicated by the distance Q0, Q2. The individual works less because leisure is cheaper, caused by the tax on labor supply. But what about the income effect? Well, this is the movement from E2 to E1. This reflects the direct burden of the tax, a reduction in disposable income resulting in a lower indifference curve. The individual works more to compensate for the loss of income. On the horizontal axis, the taxpayer may need to work more hours to compensate for the loss of income, and this is measured by the distance Q2, Q1. The net effect is an increase in work hours from Q0L to Q1L, showing that the income effect was stronger than the substitution effect. Leisure hours have declined from 0Q0 to 0Q1. So we should know that the income effect increases the number of hours worked or work effort, and then the substitution effect decreases work effort. Depending on which is stronger, the net effect will be an increase or decrease of work effort in terms of number of hours worked. But now let's take a look at a personal income tax on labor income with a neutral tax or head tax. So on the y-axis you'll have the income, and on the x-axis you'll have leisure or work. On the graph you'll have various lines going down, which are the budget constraints. And these have their corresponding indifference curves. So a head tax will shift the budget line parallel inward to DF. The equilibrium is now at E2, and it generates the same tax revenue as the personal income tax on labor, E1G. E1G is the vertical distance between the old and new budget lines, and this is the amount of income forfeited to the tax. And welfare decreases from U0 to U2. The income effect reflects the direct tax burden, and this is reflected in the increase in work hours as seen from the shift on the horizontal axis. From the graph we see that work increased from LQ0 to LQ1. And there's no substitution effect. The relative price of hours worked to income versus hours spent on leisure are not distorted by this tax. The tax remains the same irrespective of how hours are divided. And as you can see, the equilibrium on the indifference curve U2 is higher than U1. U1 is what would have been achieved with a personal income tax on labor income, and this is selective. The difference between U1 and U2 reflects the excess burden of the selective income tax on labor income as opposed to a lump sum or head tax. Thus, the personal income tax on labor income, which is a selective tax, is economically inefficient. An option to overcome this could be the Corlett-Hague rule. So you put a tax on goods and services complementary to leisure. For example, putting a tax on golf clubs, TV sets, romance novels, etc. But now let's take a look at the effect of an income tax on savings. So on a graph you'll have the future consumption on the y-axis and the present consumption on the x-axis. You'll have one line going downward like a demand curve, and this is the lifetime budget constraint. And you'll have an indifference curve that's tangent to it and one that intersects it. So the slope of the lifetime budget constraint AB is equal to -1 plus R. So the slope of the budget constraint AB is -1 plus the real interest rate. So this reflects that the interest rate determines the relative value of future versus present consumption. Savings is when future consumption is larger than present consumption or income, represented by the point D. And borrowing is when present income or consumption is larger than future consumption. This is represented by the point F. E0 is the endowment point where all present income is consumed. To the left of E0, saving occurs, and future consumption will increase, so point D. So with savings, future consumption is larger than present income. But to the right of E0, consumption is beyond present endowment, so the borrowing of funds occurs here, and future consumption is reduced as a result, so point F. So with borrowing, present income is larger than future consumption, point F. Equilibrium is at D on the indifference curve U0. A tax on interest is levied and this penalizes future consumption from savings. The budget line AB is kinked in the present endowment point E0. And thus the after-tax budget constraint is equal to AE0G, and the slope is equal to -1 plus 1 minus T multiplied by R. And the slope on the flatter section GE0 reflects that interest on savings has been reduced by the tax, allowing for lower future consumption. The after-tax interest rate is lower. The equilibrium at E0 star, or the equilibrium on the lower indifference curve, is where there's less saving and lower welfare. The before-tax saving is reflected by the current consumption that is given up for future consumption, so the distance between Y0 and C0. After the tax on interest, savings have declined to Y0 C0 star. But now let's take a look at the effects of a personal income tax on equity. So whenever we talk about equity, we have to look at the ability to pay principle, the benefit principle, and tax incidence. Personal income tax lends itself to the application of the ability to pay principle. Exemptions, deductions, tax rebates, marginal tax rates, etc. all introduce selectivity in accordance with the ability to pay. It tries to exempt the poor and shift a heavier burden on the rich. Empirical evidence points to an inelastic labor supply curve for men, since they're usually the breadwinner. Therefore, the burden is on the supplier or employee. But if we have a relatively elastic labor supply curve, for example that of a married woman in a two-income household who can choose whether or not to work, in this case the burden is shared by the employee and the employer. But now let's talk a bit about administrative efficiency and tax revenue. Well, this has to do with the cost of raising taxes and its efficacy. It determines if adequate revenue is raised for government to perform its functions and provide service delivery. For taxpayer compliance, you shouldn't make it difficult and expensive for taxpayers to be compliant. Personal income taxes are complex and administratively inefficient, and the tax should be simple, easy to administer and comply with. So but what are the mechanisms to expand the tax base? Well, you could expand the tax base by lowering tax rebates, exemptions, and exclusions. You could lower the minimum tax threshold, or you could do presumptive taxation. Measures to simplify taxes and broaden the tax base all ask for less selectivity. Selectivity is used to promote equity, but it comes at a cost or excess burden or deadweight loss. It's also complex to administer and makes compliance harder. There's a trend to keep taxes broad and simple, then target equity through government expenditure rather than taxes. But now let's take a look at the Laffer curve. On a graph, you'll have the tax revenue on the y-axis and the tax rate on the x-axis. And you'll have a curve going upward, reaching a peak at B and then going downward. And the Laffer curve shows that no government can simply keep raising tax rates in the hope of getting more revenue. Initially, higher tax rates means more tax revenue. This is because people work harder and longer to compensate for the reduction in their disposable income. So this is the income effect. Eventually though, at extremely high tax rates, taxpayers will reduce their work effort to escape these very high taxes. So here the substitution effect begins to dominate behavior. So at high rates, people change their behavior and reduce their work effort to escape taxes. Any tax rate increases lead to more of such behavior and tax revenue simply declines. Taxpayers initially work harder, so the income effect from A to B, with B being the highest tax rate and tax revenue the government can get. Then taxpayers eventually reduce work effort to avoid growing tax liability, and this is shown by the substitution effect from B to C. This is where we see the curve starting to go down. So the tax revenue depends on the relative strength of the income and substitution effects after the tax. At a low tax rate of A, increasing the tax rate still leads to a rise in the overall tax revenue. People will work more and the income effect is stronger than the substitution effect, and the tax revenue is at R1. But now if the tax rate is at B, further increases in the tax rate reduce the overall revenue. The substitution effect will become stronger than the income effect, and people will work less. The tax revenue is at R2. Increasing the tax rate beyond B means the tax revenue will decline to R3. It's difficult to determine the best location for a country on the curve, but if taxes are already high, there's a big risk any further increase will lead to a reduction in tax revenue. But now let's talk a bit about flexibility. While a good characteristic of personal income tax, specifically progressive income tax, is that there's built-in flexibility, so it's an automatic stabilizer. Tax rises when the economy is expanding, and this helps avoid an overheating or highly inflationary economy. And then in downswings, tax automatically reduces to release disposable income and prevent recessions. That said, the automatic stabilizer effects may be countered or eliminated by inflation. Progressive tax brackets are determined by nominal income, and inflation erodes the value of tax thresholds and deductions. This is unless they're adjusted every year for the inflation rate. But now let's take a look at bracket creep and fiscal drag. So bracket creep is when a taxpayer is pushed to a higher income tax bracket linked to a higher tax rate as their nominal income increases, irrespective of what happens to their real income. So society may get poorer in real terms. And then fiscal drag is the dampening effect on the economy due to higher tax revenues caused by bracket creep. Rising tax revenues automatically push the government's budget into surplus, creating a restrictive fiscal policy. Now we move on to company income tax with Chapter 14. So what are some of the reasons for taxing companies? Well, companies are separate legal entities. They're taxed independently from shareholders. Companies receive benefits and privileges from government. In accordance with the benefit principle, they're taxed for these benefits. If companies weren't taxed, individuals could retain company profits instead of distributing them to shareholders. In the process, individuals would have opportunities to limit personal income liabilities. We also tax companies to address market failures, like taxing the excessive profits of an imperfectly competitive firm. For example, the economic profit of monopolies. Company taxation is administratively simple and generates significant revenue. Companies have financial records and audited statements, taxable income and liability calculations are easy. Foreign investors are taxed on their investment income in their home country, but with company tax, the host country of the foreign business also derives revenue from them. To avoid double taxation, countries usually enter into double taxation agreements. Company tax is a significant but declining source of tax revenue, likely due to the expansion of other tax bases like consumption or personal income as countries develop economically. This could also be because of the declining profit margins of companies, the tax exemptions for companies, tax avoidance and tax evasion behaviors, and the decline in the mining sector, which used to be a big contributor to the income tax revenue. So taxable income is the total receipts or revenue of the company minus allowable expenses or costs. And these are the costs incurred to run the business. But what are some complications in allowable expenses? Well, interest payments are sometimes deductible, but dividend payments aren't. This creates a bias against share capital as a source of funding and encourages loans and indebtedness. Companies are allowed to deduct depreciation allowances, but they might not reflect the economic or true rate of depreciation. Now let's take a look at the types of company tax. Well, first we have the classical system. Here, companies are regarded as entities separate from shareholders. They are both taxed on the same income source. And there's double taxation of company income, first as a company tax, then as a personal income tax when distributed as dividends. And then we have a full integration system. Here, companies are seen as channels for all income to shareholders. All company income, retained and distributed, is taxed in full in the hands of shareholders. And the company tax only serves as a withholding tax. Now let's talk a bit about the taxation of small and medium-sized enterprises. Well, to mitigate the difficulties of small companies' tax compliancy, we could tax their cash flows rather than their accounting incomes. This doesn't force them to comply with the same tax regulations as large corporations. So the real and financial cash flow tax base is equal to the sum of the sales, borrowing, and interest received minus the sum of the real purchases, interest payments, and debt repayment. The advantages of this is that the definition of the tax base is simple, so there's no depreciation, capital gains, or inventory cost calculations, and the tax is neutral. It doesn't discriminate between debt and equity. To further reduce the compliance costs for very small businesses, the government introduced a turnover-based presumptive tax system. This is for businesses with a turnover of less than 1 million per year. But then what is presumptive taxation? Well, this involves the use of indirect means to ascertain tax liability by using indicators like asset ownership, turnover, sales, employment, etc. But now let's talk about economic efficiency and company tax. So the user cost of capital reflects the opportunity cost of holding an asset in a company as opposed to holding other assets. And then the marginal effective tax rate, METR, is a summative measure of the impact of the tax system on the marginal investment of a profit maximizing firm. So the METR METR, the marginal effective tax rate, is equal to the before tax minus the after-tax rate of return on the marginal investment, divided by the before tax rate of return on the marginal investment. But now let's take a look at the non-tax factors that determine the investor's investment decisions. Well, first is business opportunity, so profitability and risk diversification. Then we have political stability and good governance, so this takes a look at the business environment and the security of their investments. And then we also have economic stability, including exchange rate and fiscal stability and sustainability. And then we have labor stability, so having a reliable workforce, labor market rigidities, competitiveness, etc. And then we have security and respect for property rights, so investors are sensitive to privatization and nationalization policies. This also includes international commitments like double taxation agreements. And the last non-tax factor we have is infrastructure. So transportation and communication infrastructure greatly affect the profitability of investments in manufacturing. But now let's take a look at tax incentives. While tax incentives are preferential tax treatment designed to attract investment to particular regions, sectors, or industries. For example, tax holidays, capital allowances, deductions for training expenses, R&D, etc. Examples in South Africa also include special economic zones, critical infrastructure programs, etc. But now let's take a look at the fairness of a company tax. Well, this is all about knowing the taxpayer that suffers a reduction in disposable income as a result of the tax on company income. Well, there are three possibilities. It either reduces the profit of the investing shareholders, reduces the wages of labor, or raises the prices for consumers depending on the relative price elasticities of supply and demand. So empirical studies show that shareholders or owners of capital bear almost the full burden of a company tax, and they're normally higher income earners. So it's progressive in the sense that it burdens high income individuals, so there's vertical equity. But now let's take a look at capital gains tax. So capital gains can be defined as increases in the net value of assets over time. Capital gains can be taxed as they accrue, so an unrealized gain, or when they're realized or sold. Unrealized capital gain is when an asset increases in value in a given fiscal year and the asset isn't sold. Capital gains tax comes into play when there's a change in ownership of the asset. This could be when it's sold, given away, scrapped, lost, or destroyed. These gains form part of the income tax base. But now let's take a look at the reasons for capital gains taxation. Well, first is to protect the integrity of the personal and corporate income tax base. Because if capital gains aren't taxed, taxpayers have an incentive to convert income into capital gains in order to avoid taxation. We also tax capital gains to ensure horizontal equity. This is because a capital gain represents an increase in economic power. We also do it to ensure vertical equity. And this is because capital gains accrue mostly to higher income earners, and this fulfills the vertical ability to pay principle. And lastly, we tax capital gains to improve economic efficiency. If investments are chosen on the basis of tax considerations, the allocation of investment funds is distorted and excess burden results. But now let's take a look at the arguments against capital gains tax. Well, first is that capital gains taxation is subject to numerous administrative problems. Assets have to be valued and it needs to be up to date. And if nominal profits instead of real profits are taxed, then equity is at risk. Inflation causes imaginary capital gains. It increases the nominal value of assets and it may be unfair to tax someone on it. And capital gains are usually once-off events. Taxpayers tend to lock in rather than realize investments in order to avoid the tax. Now we move on to the taxation of wealth with chapter 15. So what is wealth? Well, this is the value of accumulated savings, investments, gifts, and inheritances. But then personal wealth is the present value of a person's expected real income. It includes both tangible and intangible goods. Tangible goods being houses, land, other durable goods, financial assets like cash, shares, bonds, insurance policies, and pension rights. And intangible goods being human capital acquired through investments in education. So what are the types of wealth taxes? Well, we have an annual wealth tax on persons or companies, we have a property tax on land and improvements, and we have a capital transfer tax, like a tax on estates and gifts. But why do we tax wealth? Well, it can be justified in terms of the benefit principle. So governments provide public services that increase the value of real assets, for example, property. Governments also provide protection for property, for example, law enforcement and legislation. Thus, the owners of these assets should pay for these benefits. And now, in terms of the ability to pay, so from a horizontal equity perspective, assets have income generating potential. So it could be rented out or it could be sold or realized to increase the owner's purchasing power. For two individuals with similar similar income but vastly different wealth. Horizontal equity would be violated if they're only taxed according to income and the unequal wealth is ignored. Now, from a vertical equity perspective, this requires that individuals with different taxable capacities be taxed differently given the skewed distribution of wealth. You should know that a wealth tax is essentially a tax on savings, and the incidence of a wealth tax depends on the elasticity of supply and demand for savings. If the supply is perfectly inelastic, the incidence of the tax is on the owners of capital or wealth. Therefore, the tax is progressive. If the supply is not perfectly inelastic, so it's more elastic, the owners of capital don't absorb the entire tax. Therefore, the tax may be regressive. But now let's take a look at efficiency considerations. Well, in terms of the positive efficiency effects of a wealth tax, a net wealth tax has a smaller disincentive effect on work effort than an income tax. A tax on wealth levies past effort, while an income tax levies current effort. A wealth tax therefore serves as an incentive to wealth holders to put their assets to productive use. But what about the negative efficiency effects? Well, wealth taxes may affect saving because the tax base, wealth, is mainly accumulated savings. A tax on saving will also translate into a tax on labor, especially if people's purpose of work is to save for future consumption. So it may disincentivize work, thus efficiency is lost. It also disincentivizes investing in assets that have small or no short-term yields, which may be productive in the long run. Wealth taxes also reduce the after-tax return on savings. But now let's take a look at revenue and admin considerations. While wealth taxes make a very small contribution to revenue, rarely exceeds 1%. The advantage is that the database for these taxes can be used to cross-check income tax returns, and this curtails avoidance or evasion. The disadvantage is that people may have diversified wealth holdings. They may be complex to value, thus it requires sophisticated and costly tax administration. Now we move on to property taxation. So the base for property tax is real property or realty, which is an impersonal or REM tax. And it could also include personal property, for example, furniture, vehicles, shares, deposits, etc. The real property tax base consists of land, so residential, farm, forest, and commercial land, and the movable improvements on land, including buildings, fences, etc. And this is only for urban areas. Municipalities in South Africa had the option of choosing between a site value rating system, rating the value of the land only, a flat rating system, rating the value of the improvements, and a composite or differential rating system. Here, both land and improvements are rated, but at different rates. Property tax is usually levied as a percentage of the taxable assessed value of the property. The assessed value is usually less than the market value. And in the past, they used to use flat or uniform rates. But now let's take a look at the valuation of property. So the different assessment practices. So first we look at the capital value system. So this is determining the market value based on willing buyers or sellers. And this is used in South Africa. And then we have the site value system. This values the land only, based on the sales of vacant land. But what about the equity effects of a property tax? Well, according to the benefit principle, people should pay tax in relation to the benefits of the public services received. So it's only fair if the property tax is spent on what benefits property owners. But now let's take a look at the efficiency effects. Well, a property tax is a selective tax on wealth. Only immovable property is taxed, and the tax base can include land or improvements, and the tax bases and rates can differ between tax jurisdictions. But what are the effects of selective property taxation? Well, the industrial and residential locational decisions of people and entrepreneurs are influenced by tax differentials, because it causes a reallocation of resources away from jurisdictions with high property tax rates to those with low tax rates, and high property tax rates on improvements may discourage investment in the taxed property. That said, high property tax rates on land may encourage more efficient use of land, even in rural areas. Another effect is that property taxes on improvements may have perverse effects. People start getting creative to avoid the tax. Property tax is unpopular mainly because it's a tax on unrealized capital income, and it may cause solvency and liquidity problems for some taxpayers. But now let's take a look at capital transfer taxes. Well, these are taxes on inheritance, estates, gifts, or donations. And donation taxes are there to stop people from transferring their wealth before death to avoid taxes. Capital transfer taxes affect an individual's choice between current consumption and saving or future consumption. There are some admin issues though. People avoid the tax through trusts and interest-free loans. Thus, it contributes very little, less than 0.1%. Now we move on to taxes on goods and services with Chapter 16. Let's take a look at the types of indirect taxes taxes? Well, first, indirect taxes are taxes on commodities and market transactions. The burden of an indirect tax is likely to be shifted, and indirect taxes can be imposed at different stages of the production process. A single-stage commodity tax is where the tax is collected at one stage only. A multi-stage commodity tax is where the tax is collected at more than one stage of the production process, for example VAT. Indirect taxes may be selective or narrow-based, like an excise tax or custom duties. Excise duties are selective taxes levied on certain goods or transactions, like a tax on tobacco. And these excise duties could be specific or unit or ad valorem. Custom duties or tariffs are excise taxes levied on imported goods, and a sumptuary or sin tax is a selective excise tax imposed to reduce the consumption of a certain good. For example, carbon taxes, sugar taxes, liquor or cigarette taxes. But now let's take a look at the advantages of indirect taxes. Well, it's a practical way of raising revenue from people who have small incomes and those who fall out of the tax net. Taxes on goods and services are often invisible, so it's less susceptible to tax resistance. The tax liability is largely determined by how much of the taxed good is purchased. Indirect taxes could also be used to achieve multiple policy objectives. Another advantage is that ad valorem taxes are automatically indexed for inflation. And lastly, indirect taxes are simple to administer. They're harder for consumers to evade and it's easily enforceable. But now let's take a look at the disadvantages of indirect taxes. While broad-based taxes on goods and services tend to be regressive, and this leads to the exemption or zero rating of certain basic consumption goods and services. Indirect excise taxes are selective and lead to inefficiencies, for example, adversely affecting work effort. And another disadvantage is that policy conflicts may arise. Indirect taxes are a single instrument that may be used to chase many policy objectives. But now, what is value-added tax or VAT? Well, this is a multi-stage sales tax levied on value added at every stage of production. And the value added consists of wages, rent, interest, depreciation, and profit. To free or remove goods and sectors from VAT, we have exemption and zero rating. In terms of exemption, the firm doesn't need to file a VAT return, and they don't need to levy VAT. They also can't claim any refunds for any VAT included in the price of goods and services. In terms of zero rating, the firm files a VAT return but pays zero tax on sales, and they receive a refund in respect of VAT payments made at earlier stages of production. And we have zero rating on, for example, bread, maize meal, beans, milk, rice, veggies, fruit, etc. But now let's take a look at the economic effects of a VAT. While VAT raises revenue very well and contributes the second largest share of South Africa's overall revenue, VAT is a tax imposed on a broad base at a uniform rate, which resembles a lump sum tax, which is efficient. But the inverse elasticity rule dictates that for efficiency, high elasticity products like luxuries should carry low burdens, and inelastic products like necessities should be highly taxed for efficiency. But taxing at a uniform rate contravenes this rule though. A broad-based value-added tax with no exemptions or zero rating would be regressive. Thus, they exempt or zero rate certain goods for the poor. But this erodes the tax base and is a blunt tool to promote equity. You can't control who buys the goods. The rich may also buy zero-rated or exempt goods. A credit-type VAT, a VAT where tax credits are given for input VAT, has self-policing attributes, and it's effective against tax evasion, so there's invoice cross-checking.